Good evening, and welcome to us.
A very good introduction. It has been 2 years since my last confession.
And nothing happened in that time. There's no reason in the earth or on it or
both fast and slow. I wish we could blame the pandemic, but we did actually record episodes in the first part of the pandemic.
It's true.
And then after we got used to the pandemic, we said, fuck that. Actually, hi, welcome to us, Radio Free Golgotha. It has been a minute, as the children say. Hi, Al.
Hello.
We also haven't seen, we were recording via Zoom for a while, in which, if you are wondering at the amateurosity of our levels, we're trying, but my God, we are not bright with sound. We like to make sounds.
Right.
But on Zoom, Al is much louder than I am. Zoom favors his dulcet tones. And in person, I am louder. And life favors my dulcet tones. In the last 2 years, some things have happened. Of course, the great Panini has taken over everything. But we last recorded in June of 2020. It is now late January of 2022. During that time, you moved out of the city and into the woods of New Hampshire, putting the English back in New English.
Thick fisherman swears.
Yes. But yes, we did do a little bit. If you've been paying attention, we did a few posts in the folk necromancy group. But also we did 3 speakeasies of the dead.
Yeah, which were really fun. It was great to do. We had some lovely guests on, and rather than us talking for a really extended period, it was really nice over lockdown when we were, doing classes and Zooming was a way of being in touch with friends and family as well. It was just really nice to do like a 10-minute magazine section thing of come on and talk about this thing you're interested in for 10 minutes on the Zooms.
And I liked the we incorporated art. We had someone talk about art or poetry or something like this, in addition to necroastrology.
Big shout outs to Sasha Ravich.
And so we had a few talks from people that were longer, and then a few middle length, and then a few short things that kind of interjected. It was a lovely format. We did 3 of them. All the proceeds were to charity, actually, past the Eventbrite fee. I think everything went to a specific charity. We hope to do more of those in the future.
No, I mean, I have a bunch planned. It's just a case of increasingly as people were like, I don't want to screen time anymore. I want real life. Became, there was a thing that everyone could do.
Oh my God, that is a noble thing of we'd actually host it in person, but just record it and broadcast it. That's all right. So back to the focus. We've kind of forgotten how to do this. I also went to school and got a master's degree since we last spoke, listener, you and I. So supposedly there's a performance theory specialist in me that knows what they're talking about. I say it's just the same, with a lot more having read things that I no longer remember. It's what happens when you read 4,000 pages a week. You just keep going. It'll be fun.
Some of this is bound to stick somewhere.
Get a master's, they say. It'll be fun. But I do talk about performance a lot now, so that is my gift to you, is Al and listener.
So, hello, welcome. Hopefully this is coming out around the Feast of Saint Blaise. So we'll be talking about that dear saint and associated motifs, heraldry, customs, hagiography, etc. We're also going to talk about the birch tree, it being a period between the Yule and the Imox. What else we got on the list? Gold. Gelt. Talking about some gold in terms of our mineral, in terms of our geomantic figure and counterparted. Although we're talking about Rubeus, Aiku,
Ika, Metanla, yeah.
And for our counterparting, Demon and Exu, we're talking about Duke Syrach and Exu Calunga.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And then Divination is the magic style.
Oh, yeah. All of it.
Because,
the whole thing.
Well, what is to divine?
Hmm.
What is
Right. I mean, we can get caught up into the particularities of like, cards are like this or dice are like this. But to look at it like broadly, I think is a great thing for us to come back.
Yeah. And please bear in mind, if you've listened to us before, you know that we don't always stick to these. It's a guidepost. It's a bumper in the alley of our bowling through life.
Oh, and a dead magician as well. We're going to talk about John Dee.
I mean,
maybe.
John Dee.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. We actually, it's surprising that we haven't talked about John Dee, but I always feel like we're saving him. But as we've learned, why save your load for anything? Just spill it. Did we say the death card?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Speaking of spent, your load. So should we start with St. Blaise? So I think our format generally is to start with the Saint. So, I mean, jump in anytime, but the reason I like St. Blaise is because St. Blaise is the Bridget where there is no St. Bridget. So like in so many other parts of Europe, it's St. Blaise's day or St. Agatha's day. Like it's one of those things because it's early February. So we're talking outside of Scots-Irish tradition where everything is Bridget as like the welcoming of the fire. You have St. Blaise, and within the Catholic Church, most notably known for the blessing of the throat with crossed candles. There's actually like ritual architectural things that are used to hold candles at an X as they're burning and held to your throat, almost like a weird brand X, or they're just crossed and put there. They might be candles that are blessed in Candlemas that are then used the next day because Blaise is February 3rd. So Candlemas being the purification of the Virgin Mary on the 2nd, the candles might be blessed, usually 2, and then those are crossed at the next day to bring the heat of the Virgin, the rest, as she restores, that your throat is restored, which is based on Blaise's legend, which is very expertly laid out and elucidated in the Golden Legend. And the English translation is late 15th century, right? 1480s, but which are available online. We'll post them in comments of the show notes. But Blaise is an Armenian bishop who wanders around and does nice things amongst living in caves and ditches and birds bringing him food, which was an interesting debate between Al and I. Not debate, just a clarification of text, because in the English translation it says meat, to which she clarified that meat just means substantial part of a meal.
Mm-hmm.
That is very deceptive English.
Yeah.
And it was like, but in Latin, what is it? And it was because if it says meat, then it's obviously meat in Latin, carne, but it's not. It's the word for like sundries, fodder.
Right.
So it does just mean the birds were like, oh, you're starving, dear friend. Like, let me bring you some oats.
Yeah.
Or like a dead mouse. And
is there any tradition of it being specific birds you've come across? Because I'm keyed into ravens at the moment because of a thing I'm working on with Pal. And it's definitely ravens who bring Elijah foods and Peter the Hermit as well, which is also, that's fascinating when it's like Peter's, like Peter the Hermit's thing is like, like Elijah, but only in this way. Mm-hmm. But maybe in some other ways as well.
The iconography that you see across Europe, the birds vary. There's sometimes just generic bird.
Right.
But I don't remember anything seeing raven outright, but that doesn't mean that's not going to be what some people immediately think. Certainly if it was meat,
right,
who was actually meat, I'd expect a carrion bird. Mm-hmm. It's going to be either a night owl or a raven.
Right.
Oh, Stora.
Correct.
But yeah, so I don't know the specific type of bird it might be, but the object of, the Disney Princess Blaise, like,
right, all the wild animals coming to him in general,
and he is king of beasts as well.
Right.
So he has a place in that in that lore. There's bread that's baked on his day that they like similar to the bread baked on St. Agatha's day, the day before. So there's lots of bread in those times. But Blaise is so quite interesting just because it's such an old saint. It's Diocletian, so it's good old friend Diocletian, which is also Cyprianic era,
right?
Of like
the emperor who never slept because he was spending so much time.
Yeah, Diocletian made saints. He's the saint maker. He's like Pope John II, JP2, just making saints all over the place. But because of that, of course, there's a lot of like, did this person really exist? There's a lot of controversy over Blaise's relics because it was used in French propaganda, like anti-Catholic propaganda, because in France alone, there's enough to make like 7 or 8 full skeletons from the number of skulls. There's like he had 4 heads and like 100 arms. And
So rather than being like, hey, it looks like there's too many parts here. Yeah. Again, anti-Catholic propaganda is like, go big and go home.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, he must have looked like had 4 heads and been this monstrous thing.
Yes, actually, yeah, exactly. The multi-headed and multi-armed figure on Liber Falcifer is actually St. Blaise, which is actually not actually that much of a stretch considering St. Blaise is a mask for like death deities or beast deities. But so the Armenian bishop, and then like he's claimed to have lived, as is very common all over Eastern Europe, of like in every country has like, no, Blaise actually lived here, or he meditated in this cave. There's definitely a cave in Albania that's the cave of St. Blaise. But then historians will feel like, actually, that's a different St. Blaise who shares the name and lots of the overlapping lore, but is not the same as a historical Blaise, much like you might see with Petka. Like there's just a lot of people that share that name, or Cyprian even. But
even the Johns, right, who are well known.
Yes, no, absolutely. Again, John the Evangelist versus John the Revelator, and like going through that. But I think it's also something there about like mapping the sacred onto the landscape that you have. That like it is much more immediate. That if you've never left this valley, that like of course John the Baptist walked through your valley. Like yes, that is the truth. It doesn't matter that you are in Northern Ireland or that you are in North America, but like we know the Holy Land somewhere else. And then of course, I mean, unless you're Mormon, in which case the Holy Land is here too. Right. We are recording from North America. Should anybody be questioning that? From upstate New York. It's not really upstate. It's the Hudson Valley. But anyway. So Blaise is used to bless throats because of the story of the child who got the fishbone cut. The mother of the child that brings the choking child to Blaise. Somehow she's able to get to Blaise before he dies. Right. And like he just touches the throat and the child is like, I'm healed. Which is always very formal language in the golden legend of like, fear not, madam. Through the power of Jesus Christ, your son shall be healed. And he's instantly better. Which is a little bit like reading the terms and conditions when you're just like, just show me the YouTube video on how to stop someone choking. Yeah. For me, like, story of life, like what's remarkable about him, I mean, like he's patron saint of wool combers because of the way he died of the tortured by combs, like giant rakes. So he sometimes is holding this like little metal version of that that's very tiny. But he gets this because it looks like a wool comb. He became patron of wool combers there. He's patron of cattle. So like on his feast, which is showing overlap with what happens in early February of like, the earth is warming up. We want to bless our animals so that they make it through to spring. But the waking up, so things that we talked about with Bridget or other saints around this time, that the fire of the earth is being transferred. This idea of like that purity of the flame on Candlemas that then is 2 of them, the pillars. So then they are crossed, so that you are now at the intersection of the 2 candles that flank the altars. So it invokes a cross, although it is an Andrew's cross over your throat, not a Christian cross, but like that crossroads is there, which then echoes the skull and crossbones too, because your head is there and there's these 2 long candles. Do you know where the death stuff associations like are kind of cemented? I think that's definitely something there, that the sign of negation is there. It can't be the only thing. It's an interesting thing that it does with like a skull and crossbones. Making the arches make sense in terms of how many traditions there are. I mean, often later associated with Beltane fires and things, but we see them in spring as well, of like, this is the time that ticks are going to start jumping on your capel and things, or whatever bugs you have to your area, and putting them through 2 smoking fires. And I think that you can't, like, a candle isn't going to smoke, but if you cross it, then you've got an arch to go underneath. That's true. Which, like, am I going to reach for the brain in there? But like, how the rune Gebo is said to be like 2 poles, like 2 flags of 2 different clans crossing, so that it has a gift and marriage exchange there. That is like, there's something. Our tent poles are leaning towards each other, forming an exchange of crossroads there. So it is interesting that way. Thought about that connection to the throat, though, the head's on top. So we have a Golgothan thing. Yes, exactly. It's a skull and crossbones. Which, what was it? That's something completely different. Just remembering something. Whew. Okay, take some focus. Anyway, Blaise and syncretism, definitely, I mean, for us, if you are a Macumbero, like there is a reference to him being syncretized with Omulu in some way. The younger of, some people say younger, some people say older, but the death-oriented aspects of the Babaloye complex within Candomblé and Umbanda. You have San Blasio, San Nicholas, you have St. Lazarus and San Joaquin, all being masks for that. Blas is a favorite just because there's a church of St. Blas that I've done a lot of ritual work with during my early trainings in Brazil. But also very prominent across Western Europe, in the Pyrenees, in France, in Spain in general. San Blas is there. Blas is a very common name in northern Spain. you also have across the Balkans and Eastern Europe this remnant of older religious things, of course, but Blas inherits the ritual lore of Veles or Volos.
Oh, okay.
So Lord of Beasts.
Yeah.
Which explains why in areas where there's apples, they would bless apples with the candles.
Mm-hmm.
And this is common in many places in Europe because apples are around, but to bless the apples and then cut the apple into pieces and feed them to cattle.
Mm-hmm.
So in addition to blessing cattle with candles, from Candleless, now Blaise is going around and blessing everything. Blaise is one of the 14 holy helpers, which we've mentioned on previous episodes. So there's 14 medieval saints that were kind of petitioned of like, this is an entire complex of like covers seizures, covers childbirth, covers throats. And this is a nice way to kind of get a comprehensive saint body going on to defend you.
Yeah.
But with Veles, it's interesting just because you're talking about a god who is associated with moisture and is a hairy god, is a bearded god, a god of animals and of caves and of moist earth, and there's a lot going on there of his relationship to Perun, who's the thunder deity, and they're kind of war with each other. But the fact that Veles is Saint Blaise is fascinating. Is not even something that's hidden. We know, we're very aware that the festival's transferred in different areas.
Not dissimilarly to like Brigid complexes of the Shining Ones.
Yeah, exactly. There has to be a way that this goes, and there's certain festivals there.
Yeah. It's a wonderful little section I came across. Oh yeah, partly talking about, I've been reading up on Robert Bartlett's Why Can the Dead Do Such Great Things, Saints and Worshippers from the Martyrs to the Reformation, which is really fun. It has a great index. And so just popping through the various saints that they mention along the way and talk about how not only did Blaise have like a Disney princess thing of wild animals thronging to him to like help him, clean the kitchen for the seven dwarves or whatever, but that they would come for his blessings as well, that they would come with ailments and wouldn't leave until he blessed them, which I found interesting. The other point that is the reason I reached for that book, I was looking for the notes in it, is that this notion of like having the 14 holy helpers, as you say, is just about being able to have 14 different, altars to light candles at. It's about, the anatomy of the sick person. In Germanic regions, the St. Christopher connection is a lot more specifically connected to treasure as well. But this itself, at least by the 16th century, wasn't entirely met uncritically. And I was just reading up on this thing about, and it's something we talk about a fair bit as well around like saint patronages and this idea of like, we just pulling them off the rack to use them for something.
Yeah, dial a saint.
Right, dial a saint. And Bartlett quotes Thomas More's dialogue concerning heresies, one of the characters in there, just published in 1531, basically doing exactly the same ranting of what it says, we do them little worship while we set every saint to his office and assign him a craft such as pleaseth us. Saint Eloi we make a horse leech, and must let our horse rather run unshod, and mar his hoof than to shod him on his day. Saint Apollonia we make a tooth drawer, and may speak to her of nothing but of sore teeth. So this idea of like saints and specialisms is not necessarily seen as entirely pious by certain peoples, at least. Often much after the fact as well.
Yeah, I think it's hard to tell when you have life stories, you tend to repeat them. But it was a common thing in the old Curanderismo Yahoo group when I was running it with Bryant Holman of people asking, what saint do I pray to for this? And like the one that you talk to every day, like start with the one you know, start with your family's patron saint. Like if you're giving flowers and praying to saint all the time, like why were we not starting there? And this idea of contracting others, that maybe that saint might get you a flash of inspiration to pray to another saint.
Right.
Because a good Catholic might not perhaps talk about how they're hearing the saint. But, some people, of course, do.
Right. And also that while this was going on and while churches were being specifically dedicated and parts of churches were being specifically dedicated, chalk your altars to the Magi. I should have said that earlier, as in weeks ago, which is very common.
I mean, it's always Epiphany somewhere.
It's always, I like that.
It's not true.
While you have whole churches dedicated to a saint and particular parts of the church may be dedicated to a saint or particular, and not just like the nave or the east wing, but like a functioning part of the like the altar or whatnot. While you're doing that, you also, every church that's dedicated to someone also has a couple other saints in there. So like, on the one hand, this notion of specializing removes us from the the sacredness of things can absolutely be the case. Like like I say, dialer saint. But there's also this capacity, like you would go to that church of your patron and, maybe the light falls, on one of the other paintings as well. And you would go and speak to, or light a candle and pray to that saint as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea of, on the one hand, not a monistic, like I only work with, like with St. Anne and everyone else can go to hell. Like that there's an aspect of devotion there, right? But there's also this sense of you are also on the way to St. Anne's. What are you doing? Right. On the way to that church, like who else is there? Not just what are the churches, but what are the parts of your particular personal landscape? What rivers do you cross? What blacksmiths do you go past that might have a St. Dunstan's, etc.?
Yeah. But it's like, what's that happy medium between seeing what's around you at a church and seeing these other saints that are there for you to learn about and to work, that are working within your parish? Is it a saint complex because of value centers that are there of like you have fishermen, so you must have a saint that covers fishermen if it's not the patron? Like, is there a prominent stone cutting guild? And so like, which Blaise is actually a stone cutting patron as well?
It's interesting seeing like the groupings of saints as well, right? The Holy Family being the classic, the one that's most likely, like, it seems to me at least, like the one that's most likely, if you've got an Anne, you might well have a Margaret, as well as obviously a bunch of Mary stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the 14 Holy Helpers, I guess. But a lot of them do seem to be more based around the value centers of the place. Like, it's not like, so
we don't reinvent the wheel. Like, value centers are consistent. And that's like, we have to find an answer. If the patron saint doesn't do what you need it to do, you need to augment it real quick as design, or out of natural, like someone says like, I had a vision of this saint, which, the brain works in mysterious ways. It's just, we're going to make sure that we have what we need in a consistent faith.
Right.
There's that happy medium, though, of like, well, how many annexes do you build on? Which I'm sure many of us are quite familiar with. Like, well, I'm kind of interested in this spirit, demon, deity, angel this month. How do I not suddenly divert an entire new shelf shrine? Like, what do you do first? Which is, the wonderful thing about like, well, that's why you can have candle on another altar. It's like, this is for you. If a relationship is to build, then put me in a position to be to learn more about you from someone, or from help me afford the book that unlocks your secrets, or because there's always a book that unlocks the secrets in the Western mind. We are the books, not Al and me specifically, but we are our own. Anyway, tattoos when on trees are called books, but that's some necromancy. So like the story with the origin of the candles themselves. So like the woman that they encounter, the Blaise encounters, whose sheep has been taken by a wolf, and like Blaise intervenes and the wolf brings back the sheep. And then when he's imprisoned by Diocletian, the woman comes up to him and offers him 2 candles so that his cell is not dark and gloomy. Mm-hmm. So there's something interesting there about Blaise being around Candlemas Day, and the traditions, which in America are groundhog, but in Europe are bear. So Candlemas Bear Day, of the bear coming out of his cell, his dark cell, to perhaps be greeted with light. And what does that mean? That if the light is returning, then the sun is returning and all things are fine, so the bear can go back to sleep. But if the sun is not returning, if there's not good weather, then the bear has to get out and like go find the good weather, like go bring order back to the forest, which, when we go into guising traditions, which are always a fascination for me, especially since if we're going to talk performance, like the fact that there are so many alpine performances, not alpine, but mountainous performance traditions that exist across Europe and into the British Isles that have similar cast of characters, but that the Candlemas Bear in that way is always bears are opposed to wolves, in opposition to wolves, that the wolves rule during the winter when bears are sleeping, and bears rule during the summer, that the forest lord comes back, because you have Wilderman, Wildman, things coming in with the bear, and the ancestor origin for European peoples is bear. Like, this is the thing. But that Blaise has this bear-like thing then by his feast day being there, and then also banishing, like telling the wolf, bring back the sheep, bring back the livestock, bring back the thing that these people can depend on. So the bear is a medium point, even though he's lord of the forest, because again, lions are long gone.
Right.
So the bear becomes the thing in the forest that can go after us. And if I know there's different types of bears, having grown up in California where like we were obsessed with like, there's brown bears, but then there's the mythical grizzly bear that, like this thing will just kill you. It is, terrible bear, as when you look at its Latin name.
Right.
So there's something there, the connection to the wolf. Then again, and like you bring up deities like Velis and like the connection to beasts and what this is, and the blaze represents beastliness, but also that can be used. So the blessing of domestic animals, holding the cross candles over the head of the faithful, as well as animals, blessing anything that is now like you animals need to be lactating. So which means you are pregnant, which means you will produce babies in the right time of the year. Speaking of someone who has to bring a baby goat inside because it's really cold outside. That's all fascinating with Blaise. I hope it's fascinating.
No, I think so. And you get a variety of those like blessings of the animals, which are not just, please don't let my source of income get sick and die, but it's also a bunch of stuff around a variety of working animals. But again, there is the line drawn in the emergence of what get called pets, right? But obviously, like companion animals are also brought to the church, often, sometimes even baptized by the name of a saint that's associated with that. All the cats being Marthas in various parts of Europe and things.
I think it's any perturbance of the throat and inhibition of the breath is associated with him, which, like, yes, there's the fish bones, so like the healing of the throat. Like, what is it about choking? What was choking? Like, is choking such a common way to die that like Blaise becomes like we must club it? I mean, he heals other ailments, but it's fascinating. Like his most common iconography is either the 2 candles or a candle or crossed candles or being in a cave surrounded by wild beasts. Like he's not shown he can be shown with the steel comb or the iron comb as we talked about. Like that wasn't even the instrument of his death. Like that's to rake the flesh so that you're basically like striated, so like raw. He was ultimately beheaded, because that's what Diocletian did. They boil you alive, but we're going to behead you in the end because now we know you're dead. So it's an interesting saint in that way, like an anonymous bishop holding a candle.
Right.
Which any saint holding or any holy figure holding a candle, then that light becomes a thing. And light's going to come back through a few things we talked today about, I'm sure, just because it has to. I mean, like specifically foreshadowing to gold. Like gold is light. Like I don't know. There's
sun.
Yeah, there's a reason that churches are using that on icons and on statues or on chalices, because it's just like it's not even reflecting. It looks like it's emanating. That idea of gold, thin gold leaf on a room, pounded out, can make the whole room bright in a way. Like one candle flame suddenly is extreme because the gold is reflective and it magnifies the light and it symbolizes a purity that's there. So the relationship of Blaise to the Candlemas candles, then like, which is, you have the circumcision of Jesus on the first. 40 days later, Mary's done so she can be purified. And that's also the prophecy of Saint Simeon, I think, is around this time period.
Really?
So it's the first time when they're in the temple and Simeon's like, oh my God, you're carrying the Messiah. And she's, it's this thing of like Mary ponders things in her heart, right? Of like, yeah, that's great. Don't talk too much. But I don't know, Blaise has some interesting things there as why the association with death in a lot of places is, and like Velis is still an underworld god, but we're coming out of the dark of the year. Like it's conquering it, but there's still a tie to it for sure.
I don't hear about a lot of it being a vigil for the dead either. I don't know. Is that a thing you've come across?
Like Candlemas in that way?
Yeah.
There's certainly people that, because Candlemas is the blessing of all candles,
right?
Anything then that you would like lighting a candle for the dead is there. It is also, many people bring the 4 candles that are kept in a house for someone who's dying. So there were often longer, thicker candles that were kept in Catholic culture of a bleached wax, which was more expensive. Remember, the only 2 candle colors originally were wax colored, like yellowish, orangish, and bleached wax. And the bleached wax are the ones for Mass.
Right.
But 4 column candles that would then be put around the edge of the bed when a person is on their deathbed. So those were often blessed at Candlemas. But
again, they are shedding, this is an important part of like pre-modern candle magic, as we may have talked about in an episode, that the issue is not, yes, check out Lovely Arts.
Yes.
The issue is not, we must burn a candle. It's that we are using the blessed wax. We are burning this candle so that we can shed wax over our fields, over our cattle, over ourselves, even even the deathbed. It's not about, like burn this candle and then suddenly the universe changes.
There's something to it of like, it extends the prayer of the blessing that's on the candle.
Yeah.
And that the wax dripping, which when a candle is made, well, it won't drip much unless it's meant to, but trimming the wick so that the flame is the Sacred Heart and the wax is the blood in some way that is coming off of it.
Yeah.
Certainly very different from like tallow candles and things like that, or oil lamps, which are a different inheritance for sure. Kind of segued into gold, which is kind of jumping ahead, but we might as well go into gold there. So gold, being a California baby, gold is kind of framed, identity in the West, and, the old prospector, like, stereotype, and that many of us, like, you see a quote unquote mountain man, you're like often referred to as a prospector just because he's wearing a certain thing and going into the mountains. My grandfather certainly was mistaken with it because he was just going to the cattle ranch. But there's something very, gold is the great promise. So like, yeah, I'm fascinated for, again, this light, that it is sun, that it is obviously light and star and like precious in that way. The divide, the automatic assumption that it's worth something, like accumulating wealth, is not universal, as evidenced by the Mesoamericans who had gold all over the place, but they didn't accumulate into coin. They used it for religious icons or to line a chamber in that when you lit a single candle, all of a sudden the whole thing felt like it was alive with you.
Right. So
I'm fascinated by that thing, but also the little things that come to mind with gold of the fact that after the Romans, there's no new gold in Europe. There's no new gold. It's all been discovered. There is no California for Europe until trade with Mali.
I was going to say, you got the Mali coming up, like the king going on tour and throwing bags of it,
becoming the richest mass.
Yeah,
and it's like, because there's a lot of gold in Mali, and suddenly any new gold that's coming in has to be, otherwise it's just recycled coinage, and that's fascinating too, because so much of it brings to like the not desecration but recycling of like, that temple is not being used and I need stone. Let me go to get the column, and now my home has pillars from the temple to Apollo that was down the road, and playing into that with like the spoils of conquest. It didn't matter that it was a gold chalice and a crown, because you could melt that gold into whatever you want. You could take those jewels out. You could recycle the runes of power,
right,
and put them into a different crossbow. Yeah. So like just gold itself is so interesting that that's the epitome of Western monetary value of like, this is labor. It is mined. It is heated. We were talking about this earlier with like Baraja Española, like the as de oro, the coins themselves being of the fire suit in the Spanish cards. But like gold, gold is fire. Gold is will. Like it's one ring to rule them all. Like there is a story to gold wherever you find it.
Yeah. Well, again, having just had a bunch of Epiphany celebrations, it's still pretty fresh for me to think about gold as a gift of the Magi.
How did I not even cross that into my mind? That was much louder. I'm sorry. Sorry, Levels.
So along with like a bunch of different ways that a bunch of people have said, like, what's the gold symbolize? And again, even the Golden Legend has like at least 4 different interpretations just as it's naming them. The thing I find fascinating, I like that thing you said about wherever you find gold, you find like a story of it going back. For a while, all gold is ancient gold.
Yeah.
And coming across this thing in Trexler's Journey of the Magi, which is mostly a kind of art history of the depictions and considerations of the...
Oh, is this the one I think it is?
Of the Three Kings. I love this stuff. The 5th or 6th century Opus Imperfectum, which is supposed to be some lost book of the East, claims that the 3 gifts of the Magi came from a treasure cavern that had been filled by Adam himself from the wealth of paradise. The Magi's gold especially was thus prelapsarian in origin and had to be understood within a cosmic historical context. So
Lapsarian, hold on. What?
Prelapsarian.
What is Lapsarian then?
Before the fall.
Oh, right. Really?
Enoch, we might say.
Okay.
So this means a couple of things, right? Coming from paradise over the centuries, it too was made to reappear at many world historical moments. It's said that Abraham had it. Alexander the Great is said to have had it, which is also interesting in how many other parallels there are with Alexander the Great and the Magi. Mm-hmm. Supposedly possessed it before the Magi gave it.
It was showing how this TikTok video of like how to tell statues, and like Alexander the Great always has a whoop whoop curls over his
the little forehead, the little mini boy band.
Yeah. Okay.
I think it was saying I love how serious and careful she is, except for like one Roman emperor or something. Just like, he looks like a cunt.
I don't think that's the term she used, but like,
but a bunch of medieval and modern churches claimed that their chalices were made from that same gold. So again, because you can melt it down, it's a reference back to. It's not just gold they were giving, it's giving back this sense of like the gold of creation like the incorruptible thing that was there before everything else got corrupted.
Which plays into like the alchemical notions that once you are able to find gold in the sense of like how to distill it, that it replicates itself. That like gold, it's incorruptible. It does not diminish by you partaking in its light.
Right.
So like the Magi gold, if it's properly ensconced somewhere, would like perhaps little gold droplets fall every day. That then you could make new coins from it. Like it becomes living gold.
Yeah. It is fighting the corruption of a post-fall world. Yeah. That's really interesting too. And also that like you're connecting things back to Adam.
Okay, but I'm fine with connecting things back to Adam and Abraham, prelapsarian, pre-delugic, antediluvian. Who's going to make up new words there? What's that bullshit you once shared with me and tried to get me angered earlier again? How very dare you of connecting it to the silver of Judas?
Yeah. So by the 14th century, John of Hildesheim's hagiography, which to be fair is probably a mixture of what he wrote and also he claimed he was pulling it from a variety of sources already. So to say it's John of Hildesheim making it all up whole cloth is unfair.
I mean, it's obvious he wrote it to piss me off.
But he claims that amongst what the many appearances of the Magi's gold, that this also includes eventually the 30 talents of silver that are paid to Judas.
I can't.
And he has this crazy retcon, which is basically, I know it says silver, but what we need to bear in mind is that those are both just basically those are both just like idiomatic terms for money.
But like, okay, that's possible. Like, given the fact that you just explained that in proper English, because let's face it, Al is English and they invented the language, that meat is not meat.
Right.
That an ash tree is not an ash tree in Scandinavia. And like, okay, so like perhaps there is an allowance that like, give me I'd like a Coke, please. What kind of Coke do you want? Like a Sprite of like, can you, maybe.
You said like, there's also the, you don't make silver from gold.
You don't make, the side of it of like, why would you regress?
Yeah.
And I love silver. So I'm not like being silver phobic here, but argentophobic, but something. But I don't understand how the pinnacle of the metal beast, or the Mesla flows one way here. It doesn't make sense that the Magi's gold would, if maybe it was corrupted, I could see if it wasn't about the money thing, I could almost like allow for like, well, because the age of man had corrupted by that, and the Magi, the Messiah did actually come, was now in the sense like the gold had already been corrupted by the fact of the ministry being public and not being accepted by the world. And so their gold did turn to silver. It diminished in value. Like that is more poetic.
But no, there's none of that.
It was none of that. It was just that silver means money.
Yeah. And we want the metal to be the same metal as the other metal.
Yeah. It's really hard to fight.
Every instance of this thing must be the same thing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But I mean, ultimately, it's like the battle of literalism and anything, and then like allowing it to be figurative when you wish it to be.
Yeah.
Which is already a battle we see in common parlance, right? Like most people use the term literally when they mean figuratively.
The other thing we see that I've been interested in is looking at the Ving Rhames Bible to employ I'm sorry, it's a Gene Belcher line. But like, do you mean the King James? He's like, no, I'm pretty sure I mean Ving Rhames. He was great in that movie. Again, because gold is one of the oldest things that are used for currency or said to hold value without being itself a thing of value unless it is a marker of authority as opposed to simply a storing of it. We, again, consistently see a lot of biblical treatments of, that faith is above gold. I love thy commandments above gold. Yea, above fine gold from Psalms. Or this notion, Matthew, ye fools and blind, for whether is greater the gold or the temple that sanctifieth the gold. So there's a bunch of like counterparting gold as like material wealth versus spiritual wealth. But then there's also a bunch of like, but also spiritual wealth is itself a kind of gold. And then this is reflective of that thing. So there's tension, which you also see in like the end of Job, which I'd forgotten about reading that. He's talking about like, if I've rejoiced in Schadenfreude at my enemy's downfall, like I have been blinded by the shine of the world's gold rather than by God.
Right. That brings up the memories of like, not fool's gold in the sense of like pyrite, which is so sad because pyrite's its own amazing magical thing. I think we may have actually talked about pyrite.
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
We didn't talk about gold. We talked about pyrite. Fascinating. but the like fairy lore of gold that you take in the fairy world or in the underworld becomes coal by the light of day. Like when you take it out of the cave, the riches are now something. I was like, well, coal is not necessarily a bad thing. You can use that to like light a fire, but fuel your fire. But there is something of gold turns into something far more base between the difference between like the world of the night and the world of the day, or the world of the illusion, or like you're under the mound in this other world where, you know, the weird alien fairies have dressed themselves as humans in finery of like, who's the epitome of old time finery? Let us, you know, the fairy queen wears Dutch clothes here.
Right. Either medieval forests look or contemporary fabulous, but from somewhere that isn't your country.
Yes. Slightly forward, and the fashions are just, the hem is wrong, or like, but like you have an extra sleeve for no reason, like something is off. But the shoe buckle, and we know that silver is a very common fairy connection that they wear, but that they have hoards of gold, like, and dragons and sleeping on gold and all these things of like gold is
the wealth of the earth. Treasure is the thing that and pull back to treasure hunting
and its connection to light and all these things that just comes of like, okay, then we have to allow for that. And then I wish I'd like read into that more, but like all the scams of like when white gold came out and like people wouldn't trust it because there's not that many red metals, like copper and gold and a few other, but like most metals are white. So like, if you're going to tell me it's white gold, how is that actual gold? Like, that's a scam is what people would feel. And it's like, well, and then it's sometimes under the right circumstances, rose gold, yellow gold, all these different colors of gold exist. But that's all very interesting. I think the notion too of like studying things like gold leafing, just as far as in the art side of it, yes, for icons, but like pounding something so thin because it is so precious, but like, how thin can I get this and have it still be workable? This, if you've never handled gold leaf, I mean, it's technically real gold, but like it's a lot cheaper than buying a gold coin. And it's just so thin. And that the notion too, that in order for the gold to be seen, they painted red behind it because it was slightly translucent. So you wanted to see something.
Which is all just such blood of the sun stuff.
Yes,
like,
absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And even with gold being the light of God, but then red being the incarnating flesh. So like, the flesh and the spirit have to be married in this way, especially in images of saints and things like that. It makes sense. So like we have to do a red undercoat, which is the flesh of the saint, but it's been transmuted to gold. There's a lot of really interesting metaphor that comes in there.
I really love very much.
So if we talk about blood of the sun.
Oh, from blood of the sun to bloodshed itself?
Yes. That's where I was going. That's the natural way of doing it. I was actually thinking of like Birch.
Okay.
Which was just the sap rising up in it, like blood flow, but like I do like, that is a natural connection between Rubeus that I had to think about, the reddening of like bringing the blood to the surface of the skin through illness or through whatever. But birch itself being so sacred because it is one of the first trees in which the sap rises in the spring,
right,
and therefore has new life. And so birch is used for love magic because it is bringing blood into the now hopefully hard members of the men you're trying to attract. So
remember when it's nice to go outside and just want to stay in because it's cold? remember other people, they feel nice sometimes.
Yes.
I was reading that it's a pioneer species as well.
Yes.
They all come in first after something's been cleared by like forest fire.
Yeah, certainly all those reasons is why it's, held up so highly in the like modern interpretations. Especially it is the first. It's Bethlehem known. So like it is the first, and it is the origin of being like, I have carved birch upon a tablet and you should know what this means, that there is a birth that has happened because it is a beginning. But birch itself is the white goddess. This is Graves. Poetic, not fact, but what are facts? And like, that's not the way facts work, Al.
No, I was talking to Charles, the dear friend Charles Porterfield, the other day about, he's been rereading some Graves, and it's like, I'm not saying he was right about everything, but he was kind of done a little dirty. Like it's another person whose people badly quoting him have been kind of somehow lumped onto him.
I think that's just a disappointment I think Americans are at a disadvantage in that we do not understand that the British kind of have their finger on their nose about many things.
Wait.
Yeah, that like, I say this with masonry all the time.
Mm-hmm.
All my brothers know me as such, but just the notion that like when it's found in an ancient vault last week, it may have not been found in an ancient vault, but it's okay because figuratively it's giving us metaphors by which to enrich ourselves and our lives and those around us, hopefully. But American masonry takes itself very seriously. So there's a literalism that can come in. So I think it's, then you get the conspiracy theories that are built upon those things and go from there. So I think there's something quite fascinating about that.
So we get this quality of being first, which we talked about before.
Yep.
What does that mean? There can be a bunch of things that can be first as best. We talked about with the demon Baal being like, I am the first, and like I want to make a big deal of being made the first in various ways, versus the first being the pioneer, the one that goes in and scouts and looks for things or begins things. The like initiator, not in the sense of like, let me bop you over the head with a chicken and now you have magic powers, but like the starter pistol of spring and things. I'm also interested in those traditions then that use the birch twigs for sweeping away the evil of the year and bringing in the blessings of the new year as well. So like that which initiates isn't automatic. Again, it's like the historicist thing. This is the inevitable wave of history, but also I have to help along, right? We've all got to play our part.
Well, it's almost like synchronizing clocks. The way I would like to think about it, like nature is on one thing, but you know, we can directly relate this to the pandemic experience of like time moves differently for you when you're not a part of the outside world.
Right.
Like without the connection of news stories and like for people that are now in their apartment, like for so much and ordering food and like really not leaving their apartment for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, like days pass slowly, weeks pass quickly, you know, or some variation of that or the exact opposite. But there's something about aligning your clock to the outside world of like, when you celebrate New Year's in your house at the same time as, you know, the ball dropping, it connects you to it. You are now in alignment.
Yeah.
So I think there is something to that side of it, certainly.
And public time, and just like the invention of public time post Second World War, when stopwatches have to be, when clock watches and pocket watches are handed out so that people don't run into a field that's about to be shelled by your own artillery, but come back with those. And suddenly it matters that it's 4:37 there and, you know, 300 miles away. Like it matters. And now we have trains where it matters because you have to be on time.
Yeah.
This notion of like
trains invented time zones,
right,
and planes reinforce them.
Right. But the route being like local time's been around for a while because you can hear the church bell.
Yeah. And the sundial does something, you know, and you're like, you know, noon is when the sun is at its height. It is nothing to do with like arbitrariness in that way, or which gets us even into like planetary hour remnants, right? Of like the day divides itself naturally according to these things. It wasn't just craziness. It's like, well, the day is showing you when the peak is and, you know, sunrise and sunset, which are debatable times for people. Like, is it when the disk is halfway? Is it when the disk is just touching it? Like, when is it? When is sunrise? When, like, those are its own thing. What is dawn? What is celestial dawn? What is like nautical dawn?
And is a thing determined, my favorite divide between this is like, is a thing determined by what everyone sees and decides it is? Or do we require special instrumentation and experts and vaguely arcane formulae to work out what's really true midnight or what have you? And I'm not saying like the computational stuff isn't useful and the astronomical stuff doesn't connect us to a wider context of what the universe is doing. But that the idea of like, and not just, you know, about people being snotty about when the equinox is, but like the idea of like this priori, a priori stuff going on there for me, like you can see it, like, which is also the like empiricism of it, right? That planetary hours are also called natural hours in some areas, and also in other areas called artificial hours, just for confusing purposes. But that like there are, you know, literal rules of thumb for working out how far the sun is up the sky and things, and that this is not just helpful; it's getting at like a truth and an unfolding of the world that's self-evident.
I do think there's a fascinating connection between like Birch and like the concept of Bertha, right? So like, or Pertha of, for a couple of things, just like bringing Epiphany back into it, of Frau Perth being the shining one, the bright one.
Oh, she's just white / radiant as well, right?
Which the Birch is you know, etymologically connected. It's white bark, it's light bark, well, paper birch is, but there's something shiny there, that it's literally there and it's wick before other things. And the white goddess. There's that, and there's the notion, in fact, in one of the speakeasies of the dead, it was one of the things that stood out when Rebecca Boyer was talking about birch being used to protect the dead. It was a tree that protected the dead from the living in greater, especially Celtic folklore, which it is connected to the Sidhe, it's connected to the world of the dead, but it's on the margins, and this is the natural separation between the cold season and the life season. So that blaze marker there. Also, what's fascinating, if you're not like birch oil, have you smelled it? It smells like wintergreen.
Oh, it's wintergreen.
Yeah, it's very wintergreeny, and that the birch beer is very similar to root beer in flavor. Yes, absolutely. So there's a lot there. It is part of the witch's besom by tradition, the twigs. So nice and pliable. The whip. So like birch whips for like coming in and hurting you, punishing children of like, go getting a birch stick and don't get it too thick. But like birch was pliable very early. So like it was like you wanted birch because,
You're going to get switch on it.
Yeah. And even the little Norman cards. So there's like what is called the whip is sometimes the broom because it's a bundle of twigs. So there's that crossover from, because the Lenormand cards are ultimately German symbolism, like then put into French marriage and moving on from there, given a French name.
Right. Making classy. Cooking with butter.
All butter.
My favorite food, butter.
Yeah.
That's the first tree one of the only trees I had to learn to identify woodcraft folk. Is silver birches specifically. Yeah, I have a soft spot for them. I mean, they're very easily recognized, so it's easy to teach your kids. That's what that looks like. And would gather loose bark paper or kindling mostly. So that idea of like, we need one of those, find one of those. We can't start a fire until we find one of these.
And like paper birch is interesting because the high oil content, it burns blue when you burn it. So
which is also a sign of ghosts.
Yeah. Right. So it's this smell. It's the whippoorwill color of like the blue green that leads you. Also here, when you see birch, chaga might be on it, which is like just a really nice thing to like, let's get some chaga. It's easily confused, I think, too, at sight, like when you're hiking for like sycamore, because the sycamore's white on top. So like you see it and you see another white tree, but it's not. Birch is white all the way down. Yeah. I think birch is a fascinating, being the first of the Ogham letters, like it has it's not the king of trees, but it has this like representation of all of the tree knowledge, because there are many Oghams, like, right. So there's a bird one, there's a color, there's a tree one. The tree one is just what's popularized, certainly, but that by its nature it's the father of everything in many of the ways, because it is the first of the list.
And between it and beech, we have a bunch of book connections, right? Yes. So I think about that in terms of like learning poems and having to start from the first line. Like, the whole thing, but you have to start at the beginning. Think about the birch a little bit like that, in terms of like the whole forest can be here, but we have to start with the pioneer species that crops up, and the year does having to start again.
Yeah, certainly. Birch, I think, is the state tree for your state, for now that you live in New Hampshire. Oh, yeah. I don't know why I pronounced it like that. That is not what a New Hampshire accent sounds like. So it's like
tangent road tripping down to the south and going through an awful lot of states I hadn't been through before was fun to find out how, but like go through some of those state symbols, like how every state's beverage is milk, apart from like Maine, which is like moxie for like contrary reasons. Yeah, because they're
lobster tea. Yeah,
it's all productive, trying to support agriculture and things like that. And then every dance is a square dance now, because we have to stop jazz and various other things. And yeah, how many states had like not just the state lamppost, but like the state lamppost that is here? There's this weird tautology to a bunch of the monuments of like not just state monument, but like specific kind of monument that is only in that state, right? The state Kentucky monument of Kentucky is the monument of Kentucky. Like there's just a weird tautology of it. Fascinating.
I use tautology to keep myself alive and warm in the winter. That was a bad Star Wars reference, but trying to make it funny. Sorry. Tautology.
That. So he spelled that on the outside.
Yeah.
It's tautology. No, you needed to explain that one to me, but I like it.
It is post-meridianic. We are in the wee smalls.
So birch, would you use it in the way that one might use wintergreen? Like I'm thinking of red fast luck formulas that often include winter grace. I don't know if I've ever seen people try to.
I mean, it makes sense that you could. I mean, there's so many love spell, like or erotic love spell requests that are involving Birch and like documented from the first millennia of like, you know, may his blood rise up within him like the sap within the birch tree.
But that combination of like, it's definitely not piney, but like there's a freshness and again, what do we associate with clean? Like
root beer. I associate root beer with clean. That's really what it is.
But the woodsy kind of, not woodsy just because it's a tree, but like the woody smell of it, the kind of vague smoky smell of it, like counterparting to the cleanness. I can see that there's a sense of like new love and like passion, which is interesting for it as a white tree.
Yeah, certainly. Or like even the need of like how you could tend to candles and use birch oil of like by rubbing birch oil on it, like it absolutely like pulls the surrounding materia up through the candle to the flame. Like
oh my god, and then long and thin and slender and like come up quick.
Yeah, there's a lot of things you got like the very common thing now to lay materia out in like a very beautiful silver tray.
And crafting, is it nole? Where like you know. For beading, you find all your main beads and all your accent beads and you lay them all out. I think it's called Nole.
That's interesting because then, you know, Nole is the great Nole is the North Star. So it's a Cthulhian thing. Making descriptive words out of foreign words to make them English, to make them referential to other craft authors. But yeah, that's interesting. But like then using the light, then the light of the candle becomes the North Star. So you have the axis, the meridian that you've just created, the omphalos at the candle's base of like the wax becoming the ray of light in that way. So like the connected to gold of like the starlight is synthesized, even though it's the fuel for the very light that you're lighting.
Oh, that's a vertical and horizontal.
Yeah. And then like the horizontal plane of intersection of the material that you're using, like in the kind of Spanish, they say portal, like portal, but like that mandala of like materia that might be there of herbal things that are then laid out in geometric patterns or sigils or whatever have you, the petitions of papers to be like, now we're aligning it towards this light. There's something interesting with that. But like that would be like birch oil would be totally an appropriate thing of like, no, I want this to rise up into the candle. Like what can this be? I'm going to trademark that out right now.
That rising sap of the blood rush.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to smell like root beer. While we're at it. Yeah, with Blaise's candle. Okay, but speaking of like, okay, birch is used for whips. This is my bad segue.
Love it. Go for it.
How do you make your ass even pinker, Al?
Yeah, absolutely.
Fetch me a birch twig.
Fetch me it's a new segment.
Yeah.
So, our geomantic figure for tonight's session, for
what is a day?
For a scene is Rubeus, which is usually translated as the red or as bloodshed or blood. But the red alert is also, I think, very appropriate. And there's some literalism to that. Like, it is literally just red things sometimes, especially when it turns up in the fifth, when you're asking about diet and things like that. It's common to warn. It is ill to drink, eat, taste, touch, or even wear things that are red, which I find interesting. But primarily, it's a danger. It's a marker of things not going well. The most common phrase in its delineations is an evil end. One of the other phrases that gets used with it is good with ill and ill with good.
Like Mercury.
Right. Well, that one is it.
Well, no, Mercury is good and ill with ill.
Right.
Damn it. I wasn't listening closely enough until the after effects. Sorry.
But there's definitely a sense there of like, if you are going for this thing, it's going to depend on what are the circumstances of going for it and what does it mean for it to fail. I'm interested in looking at where it isn't about corruption. Because for me, it depends what we mean. We're talking about like political corruption, which has to have an element of, there's looking the other way, but it has to have an element of active malice going on, I think, or active, like, I'm going to gain this thing. Maybe not malice, but like there has to be some kind of intention, I think, in that kind of like, I am going to use my office for personal gain.
Okay.
As opposed to the corruption of, for one of that term, like nature. There's a phrase that Hayden uses, the malignancy of the earth, Rubeus in the fourth, so the home and also the land and things like that. But this continual use of like, that's also a marker of tempestuous weather, for instance. So this idea of the malignancy of the earth, of things that are wasted, things that are wicked, things that bring disgrace, things that deceive us. But for me, Tristitia comes a lot closer to conscious betrayal, deception, and like backstabbing. Whereas Rubeus is, you trusted a crazy person who probably believed that thing as well on some level. For me, at least, there's a lot more about, and yes, there's tyranny and there's like evil and violence and doing harm. But there's a sense to Rubeus for me of this is, there's a crazy going on here. That its delineations become a gallery of early modern nightmares of like what could go wrong in a maddening, uncertain, chaotic way. And part of the thing that pulls the sense of it not just being general deceit or corruption or a bad scene is that it's that by knowing a sign of deceit, we can treat it as such. So it holds a chart. I'm going back to that. But also that there's like that it's evil and dangerous, and we can understand it as what happens when waters become deadly. So there's a bunch of really specific stuff about like waterworks are either dangerous or it's one of the few things that you can successfully do, put a well in or move water around from place to place. Again, a lot of the water signs are really quite literal. Like Via has a lot of like, oh, your lands will flood. Populous has a lot of like,
well, the well makes sense of like bringing the fluid to the surface. Like that's
right.
Makes a lot of sense.
But it's crucially what happens. It's also marked by choler, by anger, by rage. And so we have this dual phlegmatism and choler going on. And choler is named specifically for its ire. It's what happens when crazy or overly emotional people get angry. So not just like when someone who is good at getting angry gets angry, not like, a drill sergeant shouting at you to go do something. No, it's phlegmatics are unaccustomed to strong heat. And so there's all these notions of like, the watery constitution does not negate fire. It reacts to it in a very strange way. And so there's lots of talk about like frothing blood in the veins and things because you are used to working cold and wet. When you are forced into heat and fire and dryness, the body is thrown out of its usual. Because this is the thing about like humoral habituation. You're thrown out of your normal loops.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, look, to be fair, like this is a sign we've talked about before in 2017. So it's been 5 years since and I can remember pieces of that conversation. Not well. And probably what I do remember is probably woefully inaccurate. But Rubeus is such an interesting sign because of its, for me, the corresponding Odu of Ika, or its Metanla in Nilogon. Right. So Proverbs, and I can only go off published stuff here because I'm not going to be that person. But like Proverbs associated with Metanla with 13 shells in Kauri, or Ika is its corresponding Ifa sign. But take the water from the river, you destroy the home of fish. Only strength can destroy evil. The earth cannot fall ill. The stone will not die, or it pays to stoop to conquer. It's not a great sign for describing someone's character, but it is the sign where we maintain that Obaluaye lives in. So there's something, I didn't even quite necessarily think of that when like we do put some planning into like topics together, but half the time it's like, we haven't talked about this, like, let's put this in. And Rubeus had been a long time. So it's like, let's put it in, but it's interesting to put it in here with Saint Blaise, who's also a cover of Omolu, of Babaluaye. But we were talking about when water turns poison, and with Babaluaye being when the blood boils. So fever, smallpox, and other contagious disease, pandemic, when things that are flowing are now dangerous. So like where communication and culture flowed before, the hallmarks of our civilization, we now cannot speak to each other. Literally, the flow is damaged, and to flow brings disease. So the close contact that used to bring conversation and advance things forward now brings death. And
fear of death and attendant ways in which we make ourselves crazy about that stuff.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. The concept of bloodletting itself, like first off, the sangria, which is actually bloodletting, right? Like that's the art of bloodletting was now given to the lovely red wine, fruity drink. Not always red wine. White sangria is great too. But just the kind of the bleeding off of excess of what that is, like that's the remedy for this, but like it wins. It's a weird thing of like the skin is red, but how do we get the redness to go away? Is like now we actually have to surgically go in. So we want water from the land. We have to violate the land in a huge way to then hopefully like not collapse in on ourselves and pull the water up. And so like the concept of like well magic is its own thing that we should definitely add to it, because there's so much stuff of like praying before even opening the well, praying as you're going down to it, praying it's not been poisoned by your enemies, praying there's still water in it. All those things are, and like especially Germanic folklore of like the wolves coming from the wells and like the underworld that's there, and like how things are, this is connection to the dark, wet underneath world.
Right. And again, that very literal connection of water to the dead.
Yeah.
Right. Of it being water.
The holes in the earth. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like what that is of like feeding the holes, feeding the pipes that go down, that pipes are associated with the dead. Mm-hmm. So the interesting thing with that blood flowing, even with just stories there of like, who is the remedy for the boiling blood is cool water, which is then Oshun. So like bringing the health, the one that heals with water, to come back in and like make the blood flow strongly in a healthy way. We want blood pumping through us. That's a sign that we're alive. Our heart is pumping. But there is something really interesting that with character traits, it's a much harder sign. Like if you're trying to describe someone's personality and Ika comes up or a Metanla comes up here, like there's a, how do you tell this person who they are type of thing. It's not a fortunate sign.
Yeah. It's interesting that it has I read it as a water sign, as you may have gathered. Sam Locke, a dear friend and colleague, and also a geomancer, I believe reads it as an air sign because of its particular construction of 2-1, it's a single or active point in the airline. And so this is interesting to me. For me, it's about humors and emotion, but also there's that element of like the mental world. And again, the difference between a well being poisoned and the humors of a situation of an interpersonal relationship, for those things also have humors of their own and moistures of their own, versus the idea of like the contagious disease on the winds, right? In the hot winds of disease and calamity and getting het up about things in a way that isn't helpful.
Well, the earth cannot fall ill is interesting, right? Because it brings up the memories of Obada's The King Does Not Lie. Mm-hmm. So the earth cannot fall ill is like, okay, so it's that, who's the quote? The earth is not out of order. There's nothing wrong with the earth. The earth is perfect order. It's our job to put ourselves in synchronicity with the earth and sync with the earth. But it also brings up the point of, when we talk about the very subtle adjustment of like, the planet is dying. No, the planet is fine. The planet was a ball of burning gas.
Right.
That was killing. There was no life possible for a long time. And like, it's just that we are going to die, the planet as we know it, but we project our needs, or we're like, this is what I like the planet to be upon the planet, and be like, nope, climate change is going to be a thing and the planet will be here.
Right.
And at some point it won't, it'll be absorbed by the sun or whatever, but like life will out type of thing. Like, just, are we on the good, the receiving end of that life side?
Right. Yeah.
I love that this sign also, like if you're in construction, it says that construction is not gonna, like, you should stop. Mm-hmm. Like if you need to continue, you do, but there's going to be huge delays. There's going to be collapses. There's going to be water like problems. If you're planning on don't move right now when this sign falls. Like, it's just like, just stop, which is like, it speaks in many ways of what pandemic does, of like that hubbub and flow that was happening is now perverted in some way. There's like, just this is not the time.
Oh yeah. And that's classic oppressor that's like evil. It finds a way of finding the evil in anything appropriate to whichever house it falls, when it's on a shield chart or a house chart, whether that's the ninth house for journeys. It's a bad journey. Don't do a journey. You'll get robbed and probably murdered. Now is not the time to do that thing. Yes, exactly. Yeah, there's some fascinating points around addiction as well, I think, and around what's done and how an early modern text tries to talk about addiction.
Right. So the redness to the skin is like often is accompanied with itching and this type of thing. And like we even talk about like what satisfies the itch is a craving, whether it's sexual or emotional need, that then the injection of something into the skin is like in some ways Rubeific, because like there is a blood, but you're literally putting something in to the blood to like to alter it, to cause it might not necessarily be a physical heat, but a heat of stimulus.
Right. Yeah. Of accomplishment is the wrong word. Completion, maybe? To completion. It's primarily interesting for dividing because when it falls as a first figure, it's one of the few halting figures. It says we are advised if it falls as the first figure of a reading to abandon the reading. Why? There's a couple of explanations. One is that the first house is telling you the nature of the querent. And if the querent is mad or deceiving you or otherwise in the fit of a crime of passion, now is not the time to be doing careful divination. Geomancy is very good at saying, no, there's not an answer for everyone at all times. No, you like sometimes are not good to ask. Interestingly enough, what are the times that are good? Storms, which Rubeus can also indicate and be read from. There's also the idea that it is itself not just a figure that that tells you that deceit is going on, but it is a deceiving figure. And when you mark it, you are inviting deceit in now. You have the analogy you made, we were talking about, I mean, this spills over into talking about divination in general, but the wonderful analogy you made about a diviner's chart is a petri dish where we take the problems of the client and we're not just exposed to them because the client is there in front of us. We are literally magnifying it. We are attempting to grow it to be able to see what it's doing in more depth. And as we magnify it, not just in terms of looking closer, but in terms of like making it more present.
Well, this is certainly a link between early modern sensibilities, like West European early modern sensibilities, and like the way that African divination, or a lot of specifically trying to draw an opposition to like the psychological models of things. Because when we talk about psychology, there's a distance there of like, it might remind the person of something that is dangerous, but you're not actually thinking you're invoking danger. And we're trying very specifically in those languages to not relive the moment. How can we witness the memory as opposed to relive it and sidestep trauma in that way and give tools? But it is something that it does a disservice to understanding how immediate the divination is, of like Rubeus having to even be drawn invokes Rubeus.
Yeah.
And therefore through its formula, you're like, well, we know it's there because the parents are over there, like it's part of the chart, or it's because this is what's falling. But like,
yeah, the first thing that's fallen. It doesn't, not in every place. It's useful to know when there is deceit going on. We don't want to be like, only good vibes, right? But when you've marked it, what's interesting to me is we don't just abandon the reading. Generally, the advice is you break the figure.
Yes.
It is like you wrote it out, and which is also interesting because it's thrown however you want to throw, however you want to generate. There might be squills, but that means that it has to be marked. Like it isn't just like, and even if you were using sticks, that figure is present now, not just because you're talking about it, because it has to be marked to create it in some way. And so to break it is to me a sign that this is profoundly understanding that there is an underlying image magic to divinatory taxons. Taxa.
Cupping was a thing, right?
Right. Which is the other part of where it is one of the few things that's good. And there is an argument that the form of the figure 2-1-2-2 is an inverted cup, is an upside down cup. So you have the notion of spilling things.
That which is on the inside is now outside, vomiting. The earth overturning.
Yes.
So what was inside the clouds is now fallen. What was inside the rivers is now rising.
Yeah.
So it's
Rubeus Uxor, Rubeus in the 7th, not just, your partner's a hua, public adulterer. Right?
Just
not just,
would that my partner was a hua.
Right. Not just living in that town, which is bigamissio vibes. Venus, no longer giving a fuck about inhibitions or social mores, but that a partner is contentious, there's crafty, cheating components to that, but primarily publicly adulterous. Not just, exactly, making that which is private public.
The scarlet letter. Oh, but how else do you get pearls?
Right. Same with the 8th, not just a sticky end, but a violent public execution, usually. in some form.
Oh, no, but Tutors was so bad.
And not necessarily like an official one from the state, but like, you were dragged out in front of the pub and beaten to death in front of everyone.
Yeah.
The other Rubeus in the 7th is interesting to me as connoting enemies. And it's that the enemy is very angry, but has little power, which is fascinating as well. Right. But again, this is not an empowering anger for anyone. This doesn't seem to do very much benefit.
I find it fascinating that, like, okay, so within the Ifa way of reading, just the possibility of, because Ifa is derived, because you're deriving two legs at once, the figures therefore that fill those, what would be the two witnesses and the judge, are independently derived. So you have the possibility of the reading that you go for being Ika witnessed by two Ikas, which I know some of that came up for in a reading once, but like in regards to their question, but like, things are wrong. This is crazy. Reverse it. Stop. Like, do not pass go. Figure out how to end this. Just as a warning sign there, because that is not something that would come up in geomancy as far as a shield chart. No, there are alternative versions of how to cast and how to do things like that, where you could, like, if you're throwing druid sticks.
Again, as we talked about, the maths of a geomantic shield chart mean that you're only going to get one of 128 possible configurations. And that if you had two witnesses that were Rubeus, it would always be a populous judge, because that's how the maths works. Whereas with the two legs of an Odum, you have one of 256 possibilities just straight off.
Yeah.
Right. And again, like, that throw is not dependent on the rest of the chart.
But
I mean, it is, but it's not. It's dependent on what came before in the reading, but it's not keyed to a particular place in the chart in the way that a shield chart says that Rubeus is in the 7th.
I guess what's fascinating to me is that, like, because Ifa is dual-legged, so if we're talking Ika, we're really talking Ika Meiji, so Ika paired with Ika. So then by the time you're done and the two witnesses are Ika, you're literally talking about Ika appearing 6 times, like, to give its message, because it's doubled itself. And then because there's 3 Meijis, it's extremely strong. So that's fascinating, because it's not something you're going to see in the standard Western geomantic way of doing things.
And the way that, from what I've been lucky enough to hear from people talking about it, that the sign falling again confirms where we're going with it. That, like, yes, we're following this trail, and it's good that figure fell again, because it tells us that, like, yes, we are uncovering, we're getting to the root of the thing. Whereas again, in more of a Western geomantic framework, you would have to be thinking about what's the deceit about the deceit. And it may be referred to the original Rubeus, and that's where springing comes in. So the thing that's present in the first house, springing to a bunch of other houses, which is itself kind of related to perfection, but is also about, this is the same pattern playing out in different ways, or different things producing the same patterns. Or, the other wonderful thing, more than one thing can be wrong, right? There can be more than one, like, type of Rubeus screwing you up at the moment.
I like I find the physical tools of bloodletting fascinating, like bloodletting knives that have the heavy, it's like a heavier rounded blade that looks almost like a scarification tool, and then you just tap with a mallet, or even your fingers hard will, like, push it into the skin. It's just, there's something, I don't know, this concept of sangria, of bloodletting is fascinating.
We're rising to the surface. But again, it's not to start I guess it is to start a new thing. Many Grimoire operations have, along with their purifications of, bread and meat and abstaining from sex or whatever for 3 days, also include, you should let blood before you do this. You should not go in with ill humors.
And even the relationship, would I be wrong in thinking, like, how that then bloodletting then invokes a misio because of the flow?
The loss.
Yeah. So like, there's a misio would be associated with Oshe. So there's an interesting relationship there of the flow, and, like, the remedy is to let things flow. So Oshun is the remedy to Babaluaye's heat by being cool water, and here the flow of blood through the skin surface by controlling it is the remedy to the heat that was in the blood coming to us.
We love a missio in the 6th when we're doing any kind of recovery from any kind of illness and disease, because it signifies the loss of that ailment or dyscrasia, of that bad mix. Yeah, we love this.
There's something that is so volcano imagery is fascinating, because we associate it with other signs, but there is something there of, like, the heat building that comes through, and then like the venting.
Yeah.
That like really like being swollen with bad humors in a bad humor.
Yeah. And it will find a way to express. That's the whole point of bloodletting. Like, because if you don't do that, it'll come out some other way. In crazy, in dream, in physical illness, in hateful words. It will find a way to get out. It can't stay inside. You are not a self-contained unit. You are a porous node in a humorous scene.
How terrible.
So do you let it, do you express it in a way that's, now's the time we've decided that we're going to bleed all over the place?
But as far as Exu Calunga goes, of Exu Calunga, of Mr. Calunga, not being the Calunga itself, but being the emissary of the representation of this great vast ocean of the dead that permeates all living matter, the fire in that liquid, that the association with the lava flow and things like this for some authors of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, the beating heart wrapped in thorns that emits fire as well. So there's something interesting that of like the warmth, where the Calunga is, we talk about it as the ocean of the dead, but it is as much fire as anything. It's an ocean that is the lubricating force born of the weight between the two worlds rubbing against each other. So that friction allows for fire, and the Calunga, Exu Calunga, arises out of this as noble as, we syncretized as Syrach. And Exu Calunga himself is kind of like depicted a certain kind of deformed little way off to the side. Some say poised to attack. Some actually looks like it's more like defense, like he's hiding something. But that there is a relationship with both the deep depths of the ocean and to, therefore, which in a Congolese imagination is tied to the forest of the cemetery, to the world of the dead in general, that
using that whole forest with a human face painted on, there's an emissary that comes forth from that and in the course of that.
Well, in the sense, like, forest is a world of the dead, but like he's still ocean there. But like, yeah, that there's the way that Exu Calunga is viewed is that there's a tie to that mystery. There's a tie to the fluids that swirl when you bury bodies in the ground, that like they are joining the collective fluidity of the area by decomposition. Now, if you're in a concrete box, the way we do it now, it's less flow, but like, that goo that's in every box is still making up an ocean of the dead in every cemetery. And certainly the ocean of the dead of the forest, just the ground and the roots and the mycelia and like the dead that were buried at the roots of those trees that then overtake them. There's something, that flow is interesting, because then we can talk about it as moisture. Yes, but it is also a flow of something else entirely.
The heartbeat of the sap.
There's a lot of things that we can talk about through syncretism stuff, and some authors are really love the huge correspondences, and some are like, let's engage the spirit on his own terms. But the association with like cliffotically with the ravens of dispersion that can be talked about, like ravens come back, of course. I don't know if there is a usefulness in permutating on what a spirit's function might be, but at the same time, is it the spirit? Like, where does that?
Again, are we dialing a saint? Are we dialing a demon?
Yeah, or like even extrapolating to the point where it's theory upon theory, as opposed to like, but what is it for the people that know this spirit intimately? Like, how can we get in conversation with them to be like, what is this spirit in your experience? Which is all we can ever speak to on anything, truly, especially with facts, apparently.
Well, you can prove anything with facts.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm curious what that is. Can you speak to Syrach a little bit?
Yeah. So I was doing some preliminary going over things again for this episode, and expected it to be a very complicated, sticky wicket in terms of Syrach is sometimes seems to be, in some versions of the Gloriam Verum, seems to be the same spirit or have a huge overlap with Skirland, who are the main intermediaries about which a fair bit has been written now, chiefly by, Jakey and folks like that. Actually, looking at Joseph H. Peterson's wonderful version of the Clavicular Solomonis de Secretis, the published The Secrets of Solomon, it's pretty clear in the earliest texts that become the Verum that Syrach is almost entirely talked about in terms of hierarchy, which is to say interrelationality with other spirits, right? That Syrach is named as one of the dukes, they aren't called deputies yet, dukes of Lucifer. It's Syrach and Satanachia. The put of that may well be a corruption of salt. It is. The deputies are Satanachia, but because salt was written weird, it looked like put, which then became the front of that. Yeah, may well be a...
Oh, it says celebrate.
Right? It says number 37 with rice.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Cool tattoo, bro. So it's pretty clear to begin with. He's a deputy. So why is this a duke? The first,
my duke,
subordinate of Lucifer, who then has a bunch of subordinates under him. So again, we have the classic hierarchy of chief, deputy, or duke, and subordinate. Okay. So far, so good. The complication comes from the fact that firstly, Syrach also has 18 spirits under him that are the main 18 of the Verum.
Yes.
Clownek to Hugdegarist. The point that gets weird is that turns out the first deputy of Lucifer is a real hot ticket. And like most is unfair. Many versions of the Verum, when the hierarchy shifts slightly, when the same classic grimoire stuff, the same familiar dramatis personae are slightly rearranged in the order of things, some more than others. Some are very tied to being first, like Baal. But the first deputy of Lucifer changes in quickly it isn't Syrach at all. It's quickly Satanachia and Gliarept, or it's in the other ones, and the ones I favor, it becomes Lucifer's Rofakali and Satanachia. So the first deputy is shifting, but what's kept is that mention afterwards that he's in the hierarchy, but also he has all these other spirits that are main ones that we work with here because they're powerful, that he has under him. And so that stays in the line. And so we don't hear about Syrach in some versions of the Verum until this throwaway line of like, oh, also Duke Syrach has these spirits. And you're like, yeah, who's this guy? So my point is, without hopefully going too far into grimoire nerdery, that he is understood.
But that's why our listener is here.
But he's understood as that which is used to bring forth a bunch of other spirits. That's like primary level.
Which, I mean,
and not even in terms of like a duke is powerful. And again, with the other dukes that become deputies, Satanachia, etc.
It's pronounced a pooty.
They have, in the Grand Grimoire, they have their offices as well. But Syrach doesn't have a sense of like what he turns up as, what he rules, other than the other spirits. And so that's the part that I'm interested in terms of like, why do people have both their names on their lips of Exu Calunga and Syrach? And for me, it comes down to hierarchy. It comes down to there's an order that we work, and that this spirit can help bring forth other spirits in some way.
Certainly. I mean, as far as the grimoire syncretism of Exu Calunga then being a parallel to Omlu, and it's not clear in parallel, not the same, meaning like parallel office, two pillars. But the flowcharts of this power relationship vary based on which book you're reading. And some of them, it's more like you have the capeta of Lucifer, Moore, and Ash, and Credo Fetch that then filter down into what you're calling the deputies, the Marabo Mangueira, Chiri, Veludo, Dos Rios, and Chacahua. That then they have theirs, and then it kind of cuts off.
It is, yeah.
And then somehow Omolu and Calunga are responsible for all the other Eshus. But really, a few other flowcharts clearly show that that group of deputies is managing something that is unique to the capeta, and they're catering to the needs of those primary three kings in a very specific way. And that the next under all of them would be Omolu and Calunga, as far as like, so the expression of this into the world of matter, into the world built, that's not just the world of the dead. Like, how do the dead give fruit to something?
Right. How
do these spirits interact with us? So Exu Calunga does end up being a placeholder for that which is the Calunga itself, the great mystery that is ocean and water and fire all at once, which then brings to part, like, makes me think of chapter 2 in Ochoa's Society of the Dead, and like the discussion of the ambient Calunga versus the responsive Calunga, that the dead that or the responsive ones, the ones that know their names still, but as they fade and where their names are forgotten, they become part of the ambient Calunga. And that's literally what the Calunga is. It's the bodies of those that are forgotten that are being swum through by the things that are remembered. And this being built upon the dead, and the reincarnation cycle always being built upon family descendants, that like when you have no more descendants, then you will not reincarnate. because that's nowhere for you to go. They cannot respond in that way. That blood knows blood.
We can't call you back from.
Yes. So there's no like, we can't help you cross the line. But the Calunga, as far as this metaphor, is still very built upon an understanding of, especially of Fukiao and cosmology of the African Bantu, I think is the book, which is a fundamental book and understanding, especially anything Congolese. But there's very little alternative to Fukiao as well. The main only alternative is McGaffey, who is studying things firsthand, but he found that the word Calunga was not even used a lot by local Angola, and it was more just talking about like crossing the river. There was a boundary that was crossed. There was a border that was crossed between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And it is very much viewed like a physical place. It was like a Styxian river of like, no, they crossed a river. I don't know where it is. When it's my turn to cross it, it'll be in front of me. But this idea of connecting to river and crossing it is as much going into it, that it is crossing through the membrane of the Calunga into this other world. So if Omulu is on one side, right, the dead, that you are the living or entering the world of the dead, the shepherd and the shepherdess of souls, then Calunga itself is like pulling things across the other way perhaps, or is just all crossings across between the world of the living and the world of the dead, or the world between spirit and matter. Of, the sun itself crosses the Calunga line. It has to come out of the other side. That the Calunga is both, and by necessity then, a reference to the division between, as well as the world beyond that division between. So it is an intermediary at all times. It's the intermediary between the world of the living and the world of the dead, which is its own fascinating thing.
And within that, we get the flowcharts within the flowcharts. We get the eddies within the river. We get the side projects that you're doing while you're also doing your main project with the touring bands.
Get out of my head.
Right. So yeah, we see that. So a lot of these. Hierarchy also implies that it's all one way, and that's not always the case with some spirits. Gerlin again seems to serve from below and from above as both like
a low hierarchy.
Most trust. Yeah, or a malarchy.
I do enjoy that one of the main like definitions of postmodern is to the dismantlement of the hierarchy to a lateral. Like that's part of like the stack blocks become horizontal.
Right. Which is we talked about when that gets bad is we call flatlining, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, moderation, you horrible. Okay, so speaking of moderation and leveling and things like this, and the petri dish that you just brought up, so divination is our type of magic.
Yeah.
Because I think obviously, if we're trying to figure this out, like we're closing in on 3 hours, and John Dee might have to be because John Dee is an important figure.
Yeah.
Like notably so, and that is a thing of okay, can you discuss John Dee without bringing up Enochian more than once or twice? Can you discuss John Dee without bringing up Kelly? You can't. But I mean, where does it go from there? I don't know. Maybe you think that I absolutely put the pressure of talking about John Dee on Al, because if someone is a specialist in early modern British magic, they're going to know more about Dee than I claim to have forgotten.
It's this guy,
The 007, which is erroneous, but still.
Maybe no. Yeah. Yeah.
Just because we can't prove it was ever a real thing doesn't mean it wasn't.
Right.
You're not paranoid just because they can't prove that they're not out to get you or whatever they're saying.
Print the myth and something about dead magicians, everyone take a drink, being magnets for stories and being magnets from older stories.
Whoever controls the first lie controls the truth.
Right.
But, okay, so I was just thinking about the divination side, and then death card popped in my head. I'm okay, the death card is totally appropriate. We're talking about Calunga and Syrach and this mediation, because the just to throw the death card out there, which we haven't actually talked about at all, which is fascinating because it is the nameless arcana, right? So it's number 13. It is not called death in many decks at all. The name is not written. We do not speak its name. So now,
there's also the Scorpio connection.
Yes.
It's not the only attribution to Rubeus, but it's the one Hayden and I tend to favor. So yeah, it's the Scorpio one.
Good old Hayden and I, it's only been dead a few hundred years, but Hayden and I, he says. Hayden and I. Not Hayden, whom I read and agree with, but he's the one that Hayden and I agree he is. Wow. Are your pants tighter? Does the pomposity fit in that belly? Or is it just...
Look, when you just hanging out, see, obviously the first bit of time you're starstruck, but, after...
That's true. He is a necromancer, and he puts both the necro and pants back in necromance.
Hell yeah.
But, yeah, so...
It's by necropants, on the show.
Google it. Petonia necropantes. So the 13th is, 13 is its own arcanum.
Right.
As being the reflection of the faithful apostles plus Jesus. Well, faithful if we include Judas in the first 12 and then there's Jesus on top of it. But like somehow that excludes the women. But 13 being just that this is tied. We can't erase that 13th is the card number.
Right. One is, the one after 12. So and 12 having so many like senses of completion, whether we're talking about Babylonian counting systems or like months or what have you, or zodiac signs. But like the thing after that, like we've got it's all arranged and then there's something else now that comes in and like either is at odds with it or that like disturbs it in some way or has to seek that it changes. A force of change of some kind.
Yeah, the death is rebirth. The death rebirth is very common interpretation of this. It's like, oh, it's not necessarily physical death. I mean, it's rarely a physical death, except like, I mean, I loved it. Was it Red Violin where there's literally the tarot readings in the beginning and like death pops up and it's like, this is not a good card. Like, that's not what they say, but like the reaction to the death card popping up is like the petri dish of like, death is in the room now. Thank you very much. You suck, right, client. I can't like, so we have to spin this in a way that makes me not like want to hurt you. Mm-hmm. Like $15 more and I'll tell you how not to die, which I'm really telling you that I'm telling you, you'll die, not me. I'm making sure you're being the one talked about here. Death is facing you, client. Right. But I find the death card imagery so interesting. Like there is the Sforza deck, right? Where it's the like almost a Shiva like Grim Reaper with like pulling the head and like the head is on the ground there. Yeah. But in the Rider-Waite deck, it is on the pale horse, so it is a messenger of something else. Like death as the messenger of God is its own thing. Like this is the will of God, is that we are mortal, that we die. It is that black flag with a Tudor rose on it, and that like the Pope and other people are kneeling before it as the great leveler. Yeah. But this notion of movement that is with death, that it is about transition. The moment of death isn't what you're dead, but you're not always visited by death. Mm-hmm. Death is the transition between the two. And an ending, of course.
And it's the visiting of death, not just like the existence of it.
Yeah. No, I'm very fascinated by the relationship between, especially when you're talking about mourning as a practice, as an experience, as a performance. And I'll say it once on air and then I probably won't, like, that's not true. I'll probably explain it many times, but like performance being a script that we follow, that's not necessarily, it might be conscious, it might not. But the process of how we grieve is very much a script. We are performing mourning.
Performing a task of the thing, not pretending.
Yeah, like performative would not be an insult in this. Performative, is describing the act of doing something that we recognize. The fact that we can call it mourning means that it is performing a script.
Right. What color do you wear to the funeral?
Yeah, exactly. And red. A fancy dress out.
We stand suitably far away with a parasol smoke.
Yeah, that's right. That bitch. Lucky 13. Yeah, there's something quite fascinating about this card that it is so...
Is the Rider-Waite death like... I'm sorry to interrupt you. Is it armored as well?
Yes.
Ooh.
And visor up.
Right.
So... armored and visor up. Now it is named in the Rider-Waite deck because it does say death, but like traditionally it is not a card that had a name, especially in the Marseille Tarot of like, no, do not invoke it.
Right.
But that, I mean,
there's another line where we need to be able to see dangers and fatal things, fatality, but we don't want to see them too close up. And we certainly don't want them to see us back.
Yes.
Certainly.
I think one of the fascinating things with the death card itself is that you see the towers of the moon. Mm-hmm. So the never-ending story Sphinx towers are in the background, and the sun is setting between us. So you have the sun and the moon on the right side of the card above the Pope's head. And then there's the river. So Styx is still invoked in there with like the dead king on the ground, the Pope pleading with death because obviously, oh God, something's happening. And then like the maiden that we see from other cards, these are figures from other cards. Yeah. So the Hierophant is now begging for the life, and that like the king, like the emperor, like there's something really beautiful about the Rider-Waite Coleman Smith imagery.
It's not just a collection of disparate figures or
it comes for the cards themselves.
Yes.
That is quite fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So like we've now metaed the meta or microed the micro or something. Like we are not in Kansas and Alice is definitely with the caterpillar. Who are you? So yeah, there's the death card has a lot of really beautiful imagery, like the sun and the goalposts, the river there, like the fallen emperor. The visor is up. You recognize me for what I am. And the wind is blowing always, I believe, towards the wind is blowing towards the people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that, like, you know which way the winds are coming. Like, death is being announced on the wind. It is something you can smell and see it coming, because not only do we see it coming on the card announces the death.
Mm-hmm.
So the card is the flag blowing towards you.
Right.
Like, we have warning here. This is what divination is. But it's funny when we talk about divination, Al and I were chatting a couple weeks ago of, like, diviners are the worst people with, like, uncertainty. Like, I don't want to not know. Like, how dare, like, I built a whole life around a practice of, like, I need to know at least a hint of what's happening. But are you really going to change anything? Like, the tidal wave is coming. Like, it's like, it's funny because, yes, knowing what the weather is helps us dress, but it's not like it makes it any warmer.
Mm.
Like, it's still fucking cold out right now.
Right.
And, like, you put layers on, but, like, you could always go outside and go, the old joke of, like, what's the weather? Like, look outside.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what do you think it is? So, like, oh, I don't know. What do you think? Like, oh my God. And you feel like, are these layers sufficient? No. Let me get a few more layers. Like, there's that trial and error.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, so there's
crucially, we risk knowing the word for a thing, meaning that we control the thing.
Yes.
The thing.
Oh, yes. The great fallacy of the Western mind. I'm sure that is the only fallacy that ever. But, great fallacy. Not ta. So divination itself. So it's warning us of death. We've talked about the petri dish that happens. Like, death is in the room because death is being announced in this card. Like, the cards are dying in the Rider-Waite version, which is fascinating.
Right.
Like, I don't know. It brings up the angel of death within Islam thing for me of, like, that. So I can't remember the specifics, and forgive me for paraphrasing this and make fun of me. That's cool. But the gist that I'm remembering right now is, like, at the end of times, you see God talking to Muhammad, and peace be upon him, and the angel of death, and Michael, and Raphael, who's Israfel, and the angel of death are there. And God says to Michael, and this is the first time Michael sees God. Michael has never seen God in this thing. He just acts on faith.
Right.
That who created me, I will obey.
Right.
He hears him, but that, like, seeing God in all his glory, and it's like, who's here? And he, who recounts it, and, like, great. And he tells the angel of death, now kill Michael. And Michael is gone. Michael is vanquished at the end of time. And then Raphael, who is, like, hugely big, right? Like, right. Jibril is there. Also Gabriel is there, but, like, they go through all the angels. And the last one is that death itself dies too. Mm-hmm. So, like, that is the end of time, is that we have now stepped out of time because death is the last thing that dies.
Right.
So the witnessing of that, of, like, going through the angels themselves, of, like, of Jibril and Michael, and I think I just switched it. It's Jibril that was the one that was the big one, because that is the big one. Michael and Jibril and Israfil are killed.
Mm-hmm.
That the angels themselves die.
When we ending.
Yeah. And, like, and what that means, it becomes a lovely never-ending story and a house of leaves unto itself of, right. Like, we can go back into the memory and world can be created again. But, are we on Groundhog Day, Mother? Or, what is this what is it when death dies? There's something quite fascinating there, which there's mythic justification, but exploration of, like, when someone upsets the balance of the world by erasing death, by healing people, bringing people back from the dead, pulling them back across the Calunga. Like, we are here, necromancy of becoming, like, resurrection, not just necromancy.
And this point about it being against the natural order has this element not just of, like, don't do that, we don't like it, some authority figure waving a finger, but of you are unbalancing the precarious interplay of the worlds of the living and the dead. And if no one's dying, then, like, the whole universe becomes unbalanced in some way.
We need to plant birch, get to protect those deads and let them be deads, and let the whippoorwills guide us in the woods through swamp gas and birch beer. Yeah. So I think divination is such it's something that we talk about all the time in broad strokes, but I like that notion that a diviner is also manipulating fate to help create it by making someone aware of it. So, like, It's the
knowledge is an action.
Yeah, and the sibling Cassandra complex of like telling someone what's in store will make it happen half the time. Like that now the actions will be in place. You had to hear it to make it like, what does that mean? Like that's
and when we have divinate, one of the many things that when we did the Psych Art conference, Psych Art that Vanessa put on, Vanessa and Carl, and
Psych Art, yeah.
Sorry, yes,
I was like Psych Art
Cole, hashtag Psych Art. I got to be able to recommend geomancy to a bunch of psychologists and psychiatrists of like, oh, this isn't just measuring what's going on with the client. It also tells you how to break the news to them. It can be read to show this, the sentence, which is, the main non-consecutive addition figure we use, the main way we chart. Here's this pattern. Here's this pattern. Here's the pattern of marking the client. Here's the pattern that summarizes the reading. When the client meets the reading, this is what happens. Like that's the sentence is not just the result of the result, but what will the client do about this reading and how you're framing it. That gives us hints about how to not just know what's the case, but how to make that information useful to anyone. So hopefully our divinations also include ways in which we can not only seek clarity, but of understanding, but clarity of articulation.
One of the cited uses for a domino in a bone reading kit in modern bone reading as like the neo-voodoo way of doing it, Sangoma inspired, but not derived. But the domino face up can mean a few different things, but just depending on who's talking about it. But that one, the client knows why they're coming versus they don't know why they're coming. Or two, the client is not in a state to hear reasons why. They need to hear remedies. Like you can't go into the past here. It's just this person is coming for our results. But inevitably it's giving a warning about the client's disposition, knowledge, or motives.
Yep.
In coming. And there's something really interesting about certainly with whether it's Odu or reading with spirits, there's this thing of you now know what state the client's head is in by the energy that's being discussed. And we know that there's ways like then the more you know about the client too, of course, like you have to approach them in a different way. Or if in spirit traditions where you're like asking the spirit something, if there's a list of spirits that want to appear, you're trying to communicate it in a way that flatters the style of the person's most personal spirits. So we would imagine that if someone who followed a certain deity that might be, not so good with criticism, that maybe you don't criticize in this one, that like the advice has to be colored in lots of compliments and like suggestions of like, how you could be even greater is to maybe incorporate this type of thing. And the person's like, oh, yeah. Instead of going like, I cannot believe that you haven't like paid your taxes in 4 years. Like, that's not how to go about it. You're like, no, like we got to, how other men have fallen before you that you really should pay attention to is that they didn't pay their taxes. Yeah. And like, I want to make sure that you're around for like, we need to figure out how to erase those so they're no longer a problem for you. Can't make them go away, but we can get them done, pay the late fees and move on. Mm-hmm. But like knowing how to, because it is important, speaking of performance, which no one was, but how you say something is as important as what you're saying. If there's any actual import to the communication, if you're sitting there masturbating into the wind, tongue flapping, tongue masturbation, tonguing yourself, there we go. If you're sitting there tonguing yourself, that really unless you're doing that you have to vary how your audience, based upon what your audience's receptivity is. Yeah. In the same way that if someone says, I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Do you just repeat exactly what you said at the same volume? That never works. Like you have to change words, move things around, decide if it's volume and that's all it is, or decide is like, did I use a word they don't know? Like, which part didn't you understand? How can I ask a clarification question to keep a missio from happening? Mm-hmm. Like, how can I keep a flow so that the flow isn't degrading, so that it's not bringing complete loss, but like just a flow?
That's the fascinating one for me, because my one of my main distinctions that I find useful is between a missio emptying, like active process and present process, versus tristitia hollowed out, emptied.
Yeah. Okay. There we go.
And that's jumping up for me, particularly because it's tristitia in the first that always marks that the client, either consciously or unconsciously, is going to concentrate on the sorrowful and is not going to hear good news, is only going to concentrate on the sorrows that will bring more sorrows. Yeah. Which again is like replicating the thing, but it also has this occult philosophy to it of like is moving to like whether it likes it or not.
Oh, see, okay. So tristitia is, it's full emptiness, right? So Yeah, it's the
Two. Well,
yeah, the opposite of Laetitia.
yet.
But in it, what's interesting that is like it's that which needs to be filled.
Mm-hmm.
So like the corresponding order for that is arcana, and which would be like the world began in one. So there is a deep sadness and things there because there's nothing. But like the creation of the world happens because it needs to be filled. Something needs to, yeah. So like, yeah, that's light fills the void because there is a longing. The longing cannot happen until the world cannot happen until that longing has something to fill.
Yeah.
And the container that is there. So it's completely spilled. Like it is just, there's nothing there, which is interesting just in the architecture because it's that U shape.
Yeah.
Or it's one shell speaking, and the opposite being Obara or Laetitia of like, how do you not let your joy spill? It takes a lot of work to constantly keep throwing it up.
Mm-hmm.
Not vomiting, but like literally keeping the ball aloft, which we talked about.
Right. Balloon.
So that's fascinating. I think honestly, let's give Dee a shot.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I know you've done the work.
It's pieces. I mean, it's things to remember. Like, so Enochian is, and that corpus is definitely, a unique kind of grimoire magic, and the milieus around it are very particular because we do actually have a lot of material. However, we're also extrapolating from that material because so much of it was lost. Not only the famous story of, the angels telling Dee not to tell people about this, and so it gets hidden, and various parts of it get used to line pies and to start fires until it is realized that this is important documents to be kept and handed over to Elias Ashmole. But also Dee himself goes through this huge period where he feels he's failed his apocalyptic prophethood, and that he has messed up the maths. He has one of those like, oh, damn it, I picked the wrong. Turns out it wasn't the 10th of July. I added the dates up wrong. Everyone go, oh, we're not being...
He should have founded an American religion.
We're not being...
Well, he kind of did.
Right.
But like in some ways, right?
Yeah.
But
so he burns a good 10 years of material. So on the one hand, we have definite diaries and...
What's his natal fire's sun sign?
Oh my gosh. I think he's a Cancer? Yeah. So he's known as a mathematician and a natural philosopher and an astrologer. He's like a hotshot mathematician. He's translated Euclid relatively young. Although also for 31 isn't that young for the time period either.
No, because 8th grade is a better education than a lot of people have in our college now.
Right. So there's a lot of things, but in terms of being our dead magician rather than our style of magic, we can't not talk about Enochian magic necessarily, but I'm far more interested in him and his figure and what that says about a bunch of things. Like, how does John Dee form a locus about which we can talk about? How do various channelings relate in a practice? How does someone else's practice inform your practice? Where does Liber Logos play into the Heptarchia, into the, the tablet of Nalvage? There's debate about how these things relate to each other as well. Is he channeling a bunch of different things from a consistent cosmos, which seems to be the case?
But this is, I think, one of the things that I love with Dee is it's a little bit Hubbardish in the sense that like the early explorations of Dee were then corroborated by his experiments with Kelly of like this extreme code chart thing that he's obsessed with. Is there because one, he's a polyglot. He's a brilliant man who's arguably one of the smartest men in England at the time.
Right.
And certainly in Western Europe is just viewed for like, things. So like, let's explore what this is. But his maps of doesn't even ask about the book, like to them directly. But what about this thing?
Yeah. Ideally, yeah.
Yeah. Soida?
At least at the start. Yes.
Yeah.
Who's the other one? Yeah.
Who of memory? Wow. But
is it of any excellence? Yeah.
Yeah. It's almost like, was it all for naught? Or like, cause I didn't produce anything with it other than I wrote it down. Like it's there, but it's like Hubbard, like, writing, or Gardner, like, here's my fiction that was really hiding the truth all along. But like, Dee doesn't seem that he wants to deceive himself. He wants the truth, but it's really hard to ignore the fact that Kelly feels like a little bit like playing into Dee's desires.
Sure.
Not saying that it's false.
No, but that's the thing. Like all these things can be true. He can be a shyster and have great spirit contact.
Absolutely.
And those spirits can turn up. And that would make a lot more sense of him having these long emotional arguments about how he doesn't want to fucking do this anymore. Like with these spirits and with Dee.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I think it's more helpful to think about like a lot of these things are true at once. So yeah, I mean, that's Dee's whole point is he's the smartest guy. Who do you go to when you're the smartest guy? Like human knowledge is again, in the post-lapsarian world is terrible and can't get at the reality of things. We need a language to be able to accurately measure and articulate the problems and how to fix them. And so,
well, the degradation from gold, the gold to the iron, of like, fuck, like we've lost the purity. So if like we can get back to the pre-lapsarian thing of like, and finding primitive languages was a big thing.
Natural,
rather like, Amarant languages or Basque or
natural expressions of chirologia as well, of like the hand gesture stuff. Not just awesome Roman, like make this symbol when you want people to laugh or pay attention to, or this, the technical stuff, but the lived expressive humoral stuff of it, of like people will do these things with their hands because that is natural for a body to do, right? Which is interesting in terms of like ignoring cultural milieus and
they're like humans smile. They might smile at different things, but smiling is an effect and it has, a certain thing that babies will smile in laughter at things.
Right. So the second language doesn't develop until the thing called in Archean or Angelical doesn't develop until a little later, and there are some earlier transmissions, and Rubeus is used to pull the calls out of it, but it itself isn't as debatable as whether it's a language.
I really want it, but like as far as derived or like fantastical languages or whatever, like
Angelical, I love it as a ritual language. Sorry.
I love it. I love the sound of it. Again, I like the linguist in me is like, is it a language? Is a hot debate,
right?
Of like, it has too much in relationship to English. Like they try, like the angels or Dee or somebody tried to make it more foreign in a way that is entirely predictable for people with the exposure to languages that they have.
Yeah.
And assuming that, it's not, but like, especially when you're at the pinnacle and believe that English itself is a divine language, we're literally one generation past the start of the Reformation, so like English itself is like, I think the first English funeral was for Seymour, for Jane Seymour. Like that was the first funeral, or maybe it was, I believe that was it. She was the first funeral said in English.
Well, like public state.
And like that's where the English is now being acknowledged. And like England has pushed the boundaries of like, we can get away with more. And because we're getting away with it and our empire is doing well, then therefore we're blessed by God. So like, it's hard. It reminds me of just the discussions of like American Sign Language is its own language, but then there is also a form of sign language that is directly related to English, which uses sign, but that's not a language. That's a system that is too tied to English to be its own language. And Enochian feels a little bit like that.
Yeah. I think that's fair. It's very fair. I mean, there are a bunch of like particular things people jump on. Babylon to me, the wicked. A couple of European cities are also words for like bad things. Milan, I think something like that means evil as well. I mean, that point around him being a Renaissance figure is really important. And if we're talking about who is Dee, then that's a crucial one, right? He's partway this Renaissance figure between tradition and, doing something new and reform. I think the use of crystallomancy, his use of the show stones, is a really good example of being somewhere between high culture and low culture, between the past and the future, between using some of that creative cut up, using what we already have to work out what we don't yet have. And so this is the criticism of like, there are plenty of people using crystal balls. We don't yet have to work out what we do have. You got a eureka face. Strong eureka face.
No, I was just meditating like the crystallomancy and the mirror, so the reflection, and like immediately, obviously, the moon is an invoked thing there, but also Venus is famous for the mirror. And then I was thinking about Amisio's reflection is not Amisio, right? Like the reversal of it, like to reverse fortune through the mirror is quite interesting to you. So in going through anything through gazing is to seek what you don't know or to seek the remediation of the current state. It's just amusing on divination through gazing into crystals or reflective surfaces.
So there's some debate about the black mirror, and mostly actually when it comes down to is morphology. Dee draws his tools, the early version of it, and it's the goodness of the bigness of a goodly orange, and it has the cross patine and the thing on top, which is very much what Lily describes a century later, being like what people used to scry with, often with, if not the cross on the top, then at least with some, of the three main archangels' names on there. And it might be like, there's the old, poke Runyon. Is it a circle? Is it a mirror? Is it a sphere? Is it a story of the brave? Is it a story of the brave? Is it a circle? Or is it a mirror? Well, the issue is the mirror that is definitely an Aztec mirror, like there's definitely obsidian, has a handle. Like you would draw that. That's the point. So while it's mostly Whitney who argues that we don't really have any evidence and it's probably Walpole trying to make some extra money in the auction, which he desperately needed apparently, according to some, it's not as clear as it perhaps could be. Although Pearson, for instance, is a lot more like, he may have went to a lot of mirrors. It definitely is from where it's from. Whether or not he used it is, I think, still not massively sufficiently proven. The other aspect is on the 21st of November of that year that, like, by some readings of it, it spontaneously appeared. That itself may have been a vision. And again, looking at like the excellent book and its scrying record, there's no like, now this is a dream, or now we looked into the crystal and saw this thing. No, it's a series of things that happened. And it's very hard to tell. And some of them,
which speaks to the idea of seeing itself in that mindset. And
also the idea of calling being all day, if not a week-long process, right? So many of these operations are like, oh, you need to wait an hour after you do this for anything to happen, right? So this idea of like, we did the calls and now we've got to go do our errands, like maybe like the spirits are still going to turn up. Like they're not limited. There are whole parts of the Juratus where you call in one place so that they'll turn up in another place. So this notion of like doing that in a careful little spirit room and then being like, oh, that was an interesting dream. Let me write that down and go back to my real world now. Like, no. Dream is a different kind of reality and is acknowledged as such, right?
Interesting.
But it is a reality. So what are we left with? We're left with Dee as prophet of the Enochian systems. We're left with, is it failed apocalypticism, right? This effort to return to the prelapsarian, right? Is he the other sides of this, right? The Prospero archetype as well. A magus, right? Man with the biggest library, the ear of the queen, right? A gifted, again, like not just from luck, right? Although, his dad's position again, close your ears, Henry VIII's court is helpful for him. The other part that becomes interesting to me is the political nigromancy, is the spying on Poland, is the fact that these spirits seem very concerned with colonizing the New World, with the coining of British Empire, things like that. But I think the thing that's worth bearing in mind about his magic that doesn't start to reiterate the great man of history model stuff is that he's a grimoirist. He's using the things he has to work out what he doesn't yet have. And so when the spirits are like, oh, you already have the Siglin Bear math in Juratus, like it's in one of your books, you just go and you have that stuff. You just need to put it together in this particular order and use it in this particular way. Peterson also points out that he was definitely using an operation to discover in the crystal, it's called, which is from Sloan 3849, which features the familiar three spirits of Ancor, Anacor, and Analos, who also turned up in excellent book and things like that. And that's also the wider sense that Dee starts with a shiny thing, a bunch of prayers, a heightened piety, and a desire to talk to Michael about something. And in that sense, he's very typical of his time. What's unusual is that he's wealthy in doing that, not some, cunning man in a field outside a pub doing it for people.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, given you brought up Elias Ashmole, who's also a parallel figure to that of like a wealthy aristocrat who is seeking the ways of the stonemasons guild to be like, there's something in this.
Right. Swapping it for the order of the book. Yeah.
And like, okay. So
there's that clearly argues that this isn't magic at all. And he considered it purely religious / mystic, that he isn't, which I think is not necessarily a very helpful way of framing the interplay of what's considered religious life and engagement with spirits.
Well, I think more to that is that I don't see Dee as trying to save the reputation of magic in any way. He has a goal, which these magical skills and tools and interactions are part of a goal. But much like we can say, like, or we've talked about before, like, are you a Kimandero calling goetic spirits or a goetic person calling Kimanda spirits? Of like, what is your paradigm that you're in? His priorities are about serving the state, which he views as an emanation of God's order on earth.
Yeah.
That the bringing about of the apocalypse can happen now because we're in a good place. Like, there's more to do. And so, like, doing God's work, it's like, oh, you practice this system. I don't practice. I'm doing what God needs me to do.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not interested in the label. You know, religion is because of contact with other religions.
Right.
Otherwise, it's just the way.
Yeah. And that's the other side of, like, how much is he conscious, apocalypse engineer, right? How much is he trying to hurry it along, redeem the world by fire? All this thing about, opening gates and unlocking aethers and things like that. But on the flip side of that, and again, I don't mean to, like, start saying it was all
Plus, or for the survey of...
I love this survey. In rereading, again, I've been quoting Joseph Peterson's John Dee's 5 Books of Mystery.
Thank you, Peterson, for all the work you do. Seriously.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate all your support and wonderful things you do. He did a quick survey of how practical the angel magic was to Dee, which becomes, as he says, very unconvincing, right? So the aim, for instance, to evaluate the value or validity of texts like asking is in his Book of Soilor, okay? The results are basically the question is evaded, which is like, if we were looking very cynically at this, is like the majority of angelical operations, the majority of like Enochian magics, and Benjamin Rowe has a bunch of stuff about that. Joshua Norton had a bunch of stuff about this as well around, you go to them asking like, I'm trying to look for buried treasure. And their response will be, well, let us tell you why the planets are in the order they're in and why you aren't. Right. And whether this is spirits messing with us.
Yeah. I was like, you're fucking with me, right?
Right.
Like, you've got to be fucking with me. Like,
yeah. The question evaded is like probably like a great summation, but that itself.
Question evaded, ceremonial magic right. From the pre-modern era to the current day.
Right. I don't mean that it's like this damning indictment of it all, but I do think it's worth pointing out that just because you channeled something doesn't mean you're a master of it. It doesn't mean you can
certainly, or that you even interpreted it correctly, or these things. But like, I do like that they correct tables and things like that. Like, there is this thing of like,
well, they're told they have to, whether or not they do or not, or them. Some of them they definitely do. Others like, do I have to do that? And like, Gimal Zod, do what that will, right? As the angel like flounces out, like, you figure it out. Big shot.
I liked the depiction of Kelly that was in Discovery, which was, neither here nor there, the series itself, but like as completely mad from exposure to a book that he can tell is magical, but like he's in the service of the king of Prussia, but like he hears it screaming. He can't see what the book is, but he hears the book screaming at him. And it's like, there is that soft spot where you want, I think anybody who researches the history of Enochiana in general, like, you want Kelly to be sincere. He's a charlatan, but like because then you want Dee. Again, I don't think Dee in any way, we always raise Dee up as like the hero of like, you are the pinnacle, like you are learned and you're trusting the magic is real, which gives a permission for the intelligentsia of the world. Like, ceremonial magic is always like, this is the learned man's magic versus folk magic and witchcraft, which is like the pagan country bumpkin version of like the practical.
Right.
And like, even the divide up until the 2000s of like ceremonial magic doesn't ask for practical results. It's about expanding your consciousness and your understanding of how the world works, which is a really weird divide and not contingent with historical record. It's like post Golden Dawn, post 19th century understanding.
A lovely secular psychology / spiritual development thing.
So I think there's a lot with John Dee where he becomes the model and we really want him to be correct. And it's so complex.
Well, again, what's interesting about Kelly is, and again, the thing that gets quoted a lot is even if he was making it up, he was an amazing artist and poet, like to be able to remember all those things. But it's interesting looking at, say, even again, trying to contextualize them. And I'm not going to take things away from various accomplishments or historical horrors, but looking at, say, the the visions that are common when in, say, Fred Clarkson and Sharon Hubbs writes Magic of Rogues. I think it's Magic of Rogues. Talks about the kind of visionary work, kind of visionary divining that cunning folk would do that wasn't knowledge at distance. That was my spirits, while I had a dream and my spirits took me to and showed me a spiritual truth, right? And those are often the parallels of some of the ones that are shown with William Neville and the various cunning men that are doing a kind of Macbethian witches telling him he's going to be, Duke of Cornwall or whatever. They look very similar to a lot of Kelly's alchemical and heraldic punning, but they're all based off like, I was taken to a tower and I saw these shields and I knew these shields signified these people. And when we look at Kelly, he's canting. He's frequently punning with his visions, it seems, or the spirits are punning with the visions, that there is a link of like what is shown with the watchtowers, with Dee, with Kelly. Like he's naming himself a lot of the time. He's putting in his own bits and pieces of, again, heraldic language, of drawing together a bunch of different things in an effort to try and synthesize something, an effort to make gold, whether literally for various, European courts or just to, get the hell out of the tower. It's just interesting to me that Kelly, like Dee, I think is useful to be seen as a particularly interesting example of stuff that a bunch of people were doing in various ways. Like they're not the only ones doing this, not the only ones interested in achieving these kinds of things through these kinds of methods.
That Prospero archetype's really interesting, just as it is.
Right. And who drowns his books at the end, right? Breaks his staff. So yeah, again, this tragedy, the tragedy. And again, like by some reckon,
ultimately the futility of the diviner. Did knowing all of this stuff get you anywhere? Like Greek oracle, you were told this and you thought it meant one thing and it was true and it still came to pass.
Yeah.
But you didn't alter your fate.
I guess that's also the problem of trying to only seek, he's doing some spying knowledge at different stuff, but he's also mostly
remote viewing.
Yeah, remote viewing stuff. But mostly he's trying to speak to angels about the nature of God and reality above the sublunary realm. So he's not predicting his own future. So the flip side of that might be like, maybe if you paid more attention to like whether or not telling the king of Poland that God hates him is going to be a good idea for your career. Like,
he was a dapper dresser though. Like this man of style. We actually were together when we saw that one exhibit that displayed the looking glass and had the detail of the famous painting that has the skull that's painted over.
Right. And again, he doesn't necessarily die in disgrace in rack and ruin by some historian standards. Like his reputation is sufficiently dented, but like, and his libraries are raided, which is obviously, fucking tragic. My books. But it's not like, he doesn't die destitute on the street. He gets to crack on doing his, whatever version of his thing is.
But he never had his his wife swap.
Well, I mean, this is the issue of like we have the diaries. We definitely know some stuff was said and some stuff is done, but it's all the gaps in them where we start to like, what happens when you definitely know a bunch of things and then there's a gap? Like I think it encourages people.
When a diviner can't tell what's going to happen.
Right. Oh, Mendeleev, right? And like, I not only have this notion of the periodic table, but I also know that our instrumentation is currently limited, and I'm going to leave places for where we're going to discover these elements. That's some like next level divining.
Yeah.
That like not just what I do.
Well, it's a uniquely human ability, right? To notice what you don't notice. Like this is something that computers are still catching up on, of like why we can look for things that aren't there is still one of the unique qualities of a human. Because if you don't know what to look for, how do you look for it? No, it has to look for what it knows to look for, which is true. Like it's a hallmark of like this the scanning brain that's constantly assessing everything and being like, what are the patterns I know? Where are we? So it's interesting. It does tie up with like certainly Enochian, and the search for the key that holds everything is very much tied into divination in that way of like how, especially when you have what is ostensibly all the knowledge of the known world at your fingertips that you view valuable, and like you still then are like, but how come I don't know everything?
Yeah, better try and break into heaven's libraries.
Well, I think that's probably just as good a push pin in the helium of the wee outers that we have finding ourselves within. Wow.
So we've had a lot of Scorpio times.
A lot
This evening. Not just in general, but like tonight we've talked Death card, we've talked Rubeus, its counterparted Odu.
Calunga, Syrach.
The spirit that comes forth and what spirits that come forth after it comes forth. The bringing forth of other spirits, the rising of the sap.
You know, in an elephant train, every elephant is important. Like, otherwise there's a gap.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Don't clog the convoy. But yeah, I think this, with Birch and Gold and Saint Blaise, there's like,
And mysteries of articulation and what gets stuck in
certainly what gets stuck in the throat, and the ability of like how important is a prayer for like, although it's not directly articulation for St. Blaise, but for like the power of the throat to speak, which is the divine word, which is the divine mandate, which allows light and the world to become golden with light, to breathe across the face of the waters, which is the ocean of the dead, the matter that like, how can spirit and matter be united in this thing? Yeah.
And the crossbones of the pillars of light.
Yeah.
Bent to each other. Or gift.
Or even, the candles, seeing the pillars on either side of the setting sun on the death card, or death himself, if you view that flagpole as a torch, like the banner itself is like the flame of a candle that announces the tent pole that crosses with our own spine and brings.
The vigil candle that we watch fearlessly in case we fall asleep, and it dictates the...
We're really good at extrapolating how things are connected on a really bad poetry level.
Well, we're back, dear listener. Welcome back.
Did you miss us? Well, then, I think that's as good a place as any to stop. It's, which I've said already a few minutes ago before we waxed poetically. But thank you again for joining us back in this foray. We hope to be recording many more this year. Hopefully, a few speakeasies in store.
Yeah.
And go from there. But thank you so much. Check us out on the website, www.radiofreegolgotha.com, as well as the Facebook chat group we have on all things folk necromantic. So folk necromancy is the name of the group. You can search it and respond to the questionnaire, and maybe we can let you in and help us find things to chat about.
It's nice when people, and I don't mean to get into the archives of like shittiest responses, but it's nice when the two questions, I don't think we're revealing it. I think the two questions on like the folk necromancy group of joining it are, hey, what you here for? What are you interested in?
What brings the mancy in your necro?
Right. And the second one is, hey, some people are going to have some ideas about death that are going to seem weird and kind of freaky or even like horrible to you. Do you promise not to be a dick about it? Is basically what it boils down to. And the number of people that are like, no, I do not promise that. I promise nothing. I will absolutely be a dick. Like, no, stop busy lifting drinks. What? I don't understand. Thank you for being honest. Like, again, great to have the Rubeus pop up early.
Yeah.
If you're going to fail early, if you're going to see deceit as soon as possible.
If someone shows you their ass, believe them.
Right.
If Death's banner is pointed at you, run the other way.
Right.
Horses are stupid. Throw a blazed apple at it.
Mm-hmm.
Blazed. Yeah, so find us, tag us. Al loves chatting to people on his AOL Messenger something. I don't know.
I've always been a huge fan of humans. With they're great folks.
All right, thank you so much, and we will 007 out of here.
Cheers, loves. Thanks for joining us. Catch you soon.